On a quiet morning in 1994, 62 children at a small school in Zimbabwe saw something no one could explain. Silver crafts descending from the sky, and beings with enormous black eyes sending a message one they didn't speak, but we could feel. 31 years later, their warning still echoes. What did they see? And what are we missing right above our heads? Chapter 1. The morning at Ariel School, the morning sun rose gently over Rua, Zimbabwe, spilling golden light across the small, quiet town. The air was soft, warm, and still, carrying the faint scent of dew from the grass and the earthy aroma of the surrounding woodland. Children at the Ariel School spilled out onto the playground for their mid-morning break, laughter echoing softly against the walls of the small, multicolored school buildings. Some ran across the field in pairs. Others gathered in small circles, quietly talking, pointing at clouds, or noticing the way the sunlight danced through the leaves of the surrounding Mayamba woodland. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. A gentle breeze rustled the branches, carrying with it the occasional call of a bird, a distant bark of a dog, the soft hum of life going about its usual business. Yet, beneath this ordinary morning, there was an imperceptible hum of expectation, a subtle shift in the air, as though the day was quietly preparing to open a door to something unseen, something extraordinary. The children played and ran, some skipping stones near the gravel path, others chasing shadows under the trees. They laughed freely, unaware that the very sky above them would soon whisper secrets no human had fully grasped. And then, almost barely noticeable, a shimmer caught their eyes far off in the rough bushland just beyond the edge of the playground. At first, it seemed like sunlight reflecting off metal or perhaps the shimmer of a distant water puddle. Yet, as the children squinted and tilted their heads, the shapes became clearer, sharper, more deliberate. One silver craft hovered just above the brush, its metallic surface catching the morning sun in a way that made it appear almost alive. It moved slowly, smoothly, without sound, as if gliding on currents unseen. Tena Sekon's smaller craft appeared, glowing faintly, moving in patterns that seemed impossible for any human technology. The children stopped, frozen in their tracks, their breaths held tight in their chests. The laughter faded, replaced by an intense, quiet focus. Eyes widened, fingers pointed, hearts pounded in synchrony with a rhythm they did not yet understand. A soft murmur passed among them, not in words, but in shared wonder. One child whispered, almost unconsciously, "Look at that. It's moving differently." Others nodded, their faces lighting up with both curiosity and a strange, unnameable emotion. There was no fear here, only a growing awareness that something unusual, something beyond ordinary understanding, was unfolding before their eyes. As the crafts hovered closer, the children noticed subtle details. The surface of the silver craft rippled slightly, reflecting the surrounding woodland, the playground, and the children themselves in distorted patterns. Small lights traced along its contours, blinking in quiet rhythm. The smaller crafts darted with a grace that defied gravity, performing sharp turns and sudden ascents with effortless elegance. The children gasped softly, their eyes tracing the movements, their minds trying to comprehend the impossible. Then the beings appeared. At first, they were just silhouettes, dark shapes moving near or beside the craft. But as the children's eyes adjusted, details became clear. The beings were small, no taller than a child, with pale skin that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, and eyes so large, dark, and almond-shaped that they seemed to hold entire galaxies within them. The hair was long and black, flowing in the windless air, and their movements were deliberate, calm, and measured. Though the beings spoke no words, the children felt communication ripple directly into their minds. It was not a voice, but a flow of images, emotions, and understanding. Some children saw images of dying trees, polluted skies, and rivers choked with debris. Others felt waves of sorrow and concern, urging careful attention to the world around them. One child later described it as a feeling that the earth itself was breathing, fragile and needing care, and that these small humans had a role to play in its well-being. The children's emotions swirled curiosity, wonder, awe, and gentle apprehension. They observed every movement, the way the beings tilted their heads as if observing the children individually, the slow gestures that conveyed sadness without threat, the way the crafts remained silent, hovering and glowing, almost as if participating in the silent communication. The air itself seemed charged, humming faintly in resonance with the unseen energy surrounding the craft. Minutes stretched and contracted in a timeless flow. Some children felt as though hours had passed in a heartbeat, while others barely noticed the passage of time. The playground felt suspended, caught between ordinary reality and the extraordinary moment unfolding above the grass and under the sky. The birds had quieted. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The sunlight seemed warmer, softer, almost intentionally illuminating the field where the children stood in wonder. The children noticed the smallest details, the reflection of the sun on the craft's surfaces, the way shadows bent unnaturally around the beings, the subtle pulse of light from the smaller crafts that mirrored their own heartbeats. Some children instinctively held hands, feeling an unspoken solidarity, a shared understanding that they were witnessing something profound, something that would remain with them forever. The crafts did not approach aggressively, nor did they descend too closely. Their presence was gentle yet compelling, a quiet insistence that the children observe, feel, and understand. In that moment, there was no need for words or explanation. The communication was complete in its silence, filled with images, sensations, and understanding. The children felt a deep connection to each other, to the earth, and to whatever intelligence had chosen to reveal itself that morning. Time passed. The crafts began to ascend slowly, moving higher into the sky, performing movements that were deliberate, elegant, and otherworldly. Then, in a blink that felt both instant and eternal, they vanished. The sky returned to its ordinary blue. The birds resumed their calls. The wind whispered through the leaves, and the playground seemed suddenly ordinary again. But the children knew it was not the same. Something extraordinary had touched their lives, leaving impressions that would not fade. Some children ran to each other, whispering and pointing, their voices tinged with excitement and disbelief. Others stood quietly, absorbing every detail in silence. They shared what they had felt, the images they had seen, the emotions that had coursed through them. A subtle bond formed among them, a silent agreement that this morning had changed everything, even if they could not yet fully articulate why. As the children returned to their classrooms, their minds carried both wonder and responsibility. The experience had been gentle yet profound. It was as if the sky itself had given them a message, not a warning, not a command, but an invitation to notice, to care, and to reflect. Every leaf, every bird, every shadow now seemed connected to something larger, more intricate, and more meaningful than they had ever realized. Even decades later, these children would remember every detail. The sunlight on the crafts, the flowing hair of the beings, the pulse of the air, the images that had imprinted directly on their minds. These memories were vivid, lasting, and formative. The lesson of the morning, the quiet reminder of responsibility, care, and connection remained as alive in their hearts as the moment itself. And so, the morning ended, not with noise or chaos, but with quiet awe and reflective wonder. The playground returned to normal, the children to their routines, but the invisible threads of understanding and insight had been woven permanently into their consciousness. The Ariel School morning of September 16th, 1994, was ordinary only in appearance. Beneath that calm, the world had shifted ever so slightly, and the children had witnessed the beginning of something eternal, a gentle, persistent, and mysterious connection between the human heart and the mysteries of the sky. Chapter 2. The silver shapes in the sky. The morning at Ariel School had begun like any other, yet the quiet tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The children, still wide-eyed from what they had seen, lingered on the playground as if drawn by an invisible thread toward the edge of the bushland. Every movement of the wind, every rustle of leaves, seemed to echo with a gentle urgency, a reminder that something extraordinary had visited them. The sunlight fell in long, warm streams across the playground, and the air held a crispness that made the children shiver lightly. Though the day was not cold, some of the younger children, barely old enough to understand the magnitude of what they had seen, clutched at the hands of friends whispering words that barely carried meaning yet expressed awe. Did it really move like that? Was it real? Will it come back? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, yet somehow unnecessary. The sky had already spoken in its own silent, undeniable language. Then, beyond the rough bushland, the silver shapes appeared again. The children froze, instinctively sensing that this moment was connected to the one they had experienced minutes before. The main craft, vast and metallic, shimmered under the sun, catching every eye at once. It was not threatening. It was gentle, deliberate, almost contemplative in its hovering. Around it, the smaller lights danced, weaving patterns that no human machine could replicate, twisting, turning, and ascending with an elegance that seemed almost musical, as if each movement were part of a silent, cosmic symphony. The children could not look away. Their hearts pounded, but fear was absent. Instead, a deep sense of wonder and responsibility spread through the group. They could feel something greater than themselves brushing against the edges of their perception, and it was calling for attention, for awareness, for understanding. One child tilted their head and whispered, "It's like it's showing us something," and another nodded, eyes wide, understanding without words. The beings appeared, stepping carefully from the craft's doorway. Their movements were fluid, precise, and calm. Yet each motion seemed laden with meaning. Though they did not speak, their eyes immense, dark, endless communicated volumes. The children felt images and feelings rush into their minds. Forests with leaves browned and brittle, skies heavy with gray smoke, rivers choked and lifeless. These impressions were not frightening. They were warnings, but insistent about the care required to nurture the world around them. As the children absorbed these messages, they noticed the subtle details of the being's appearance. Their pale skin reflected the sun's glow in soft silver tones. Their long black hair moved as if in a breeze that could not be felt. Their clothing, tight and reflective, hinted at a sophistication that the children could only imagine. Yet there was nothing aggressive in their presence, only a sense of profound intelligence, empathy, and understanding. Each child experienced the message slightly differently, yet the central theme was identical. There was no need for spoken words. The emotions and images carried everything they needed to know. Some children felt sorrow for the world's forests. Others felt the urgency of taking care of water and air, while a few simply felt a quiet peace, as if understanding that life was delicate, beautiful, and deserving of attention. The sky had given them knowledge that transcended language. The silver craft shifted slightly, moving closer, not threatening, but observant. The smaller lights darted between the trees, creating a pattern that resembled constellations in motion. One child held their breath, noticing how shadows moved unnaturally across the playground, almost bending to accommodate the presence of the crafts. The children whispered to one another, words carried on their breaths. Do they see us? Are they teaching us? What do they want? The answers were felt rather than spoken, and in that silent understanding, each child grasped the importance of the moment. Time seemed to stretch and fold. What might have been minutes felt like hours. Yet the children could not tear their eyes away. Every movement, every reflection of light, every subtle shift in the being's posture was recorded in their minds, vivid and permanent. The smallest details, how a leaf trembled in the shadow of a hovering craft, how the sun glinted off a polished surface, how a bird circled once and then vanished, were etched into memory with astonishing clarity. Some children instinctively took notes in their minds, memorizing what they saw to share later. Others simply allowed themselves to feel fully aware that the experience was beyond ordinary understanding. And as the crafts hovered, a gentle breeze carried a sense of completion, a quiet rhythm that suggested the lesson was almost complete. Then, as if acknowledging the children's understanding, the main craft began to rise slowly. The smaller lights followed, weaving patterns that shimmered like a river of stars. The beings watched, their eyes deep, infinite, and knowing. The children felt a gentle warmth, a subtle reassurance that the knowledge imparted was enough. They had understood, and that understanding would grow with them for the rest of their lives. The crafts ascended, moving higher and higher, until they became mere points of light in the sky. Then, in a moment, both instantaneous and eternal, they vanished. The sky returned to its ordinary blue. The wind whispered through the leaves, and the birds resumed their songs. Yet the children knew it was no longer the same playground. Something extraordinary had occurred, and the memory would remain vivid, permanent, and transformative, even as they returned to their routines. Their hearts carried a quiet awe. Conversations in hushed tones swept across the playground. Children sharing what they had felt and seen. Each perspective added a new layer of understanding, a new depth to the shared experience. One child said softly, "It felt like they knew everything," and another nodded, like they could see our thoughts. The connection was undeniable, and it was not fleeting. Teachers arriving from the staff room noticed the children's unusual quietness, the intensity in their eyes, but no words could capture the experience. It was not frightening. It was profound. Each child had glimpsed a truth that transcended ordinary life, and in that truth lay responsibility, understanding, and awe. As the day progressed, the children could not forget the message carried without words. They found themselves observing the environment around them more carefully, how the wind moved through the trees, how insects traveled along the grass, how the sunlight glinted on every surface. Their awareness deepened, not in fear, but in curiosity and care. Each moment became an opportunity to reflect, to notice, to connect. Even decades later, those impressions remained vivid. The children now grown could recall the smallest details with clarity. The precise movement of the crafts, the glow of the silver surfaces, the fluidity of the beings, gestures, and the gentle, silent warnings that had been imparted. These memories were not fleeting. They were permanent threads woven into their consciousness, shaping perspectives, choices, and values. The silver shapes in the sky had left a mark not only on the playground that morning, but on the children's very understanding of the world. They had glimpsed intelligence beyond their own, communication beyond speech, and a profound message about the care of the earth. In the years that followed, these lessons would grow, forming the foundation for choices, creativity, careers, and moral awareness. And as the sunlight waned into the afternoon, the children carried with them a quiet knowledge that the universe was more than what they could see, that intelligence could communicate in silence, and that every small action mattered. The silver shapes had come and gone, but the impression remained a gentle, persistent echo of understanding, curiosity, and awe. The playground returned to ordinary play, but the children were no longer ordinary. Their hearts, minds, and senses had been expanded. The sky had spoken, and they had listened. And in that listening, a seed was planted, a seed of awareness that would grow slowly, steadily, and persistently, guiding them toward choices that honored life, curiosity, and the mysteries of the universe. And even as the shadows lengthened and the children reluctantly returned indoors, a sense of calm wonder lingered. The memory of silver shapes, silent banks, and the lessons conveyed without words remained as vivid as the morning sun on their skin. They had witnessed something beyond the ordinary, something that would remain with them forever, a reminder of connection, care, and infinite possibility. Chapter 3. Whispers in the bush. The day had settled into a gentle rhythm. The sunlight filtered through the branches of the Mayamba woodland, casting long, dancing shadows across the playground. Children moved quietly now, their earlier excitement tempered by a deep, reflective awe. There was a hum of curiosity in the air, a subtle energy that seemed to linger in every corner, every leaf, every whispering wind. Beyond the playground, the rough bushland stretched, ancient and dense, with trees standing like silent sentinels. The children felt drawn to its edge, as if the very earth were inviting them to observe, to listen, to understand. The morning's encounter had awakened something inside them, a quiet attentiveness, a sense that the world was more alive and interconnected than they had ever known. It was then that they noticed small details that had gone unnoticed before. A bird perched high in the branches, tilting its head as if observing them knowingly. A leaf trembled, catching sunlight like a fleeting silver spark. The shadows moved subtly, and the grass whispered under a gentle breeze. Everything seemed to pulse with quiet significance. The children sensed that these were not ordinary moments, but echoes of the intelligence they had glimpsed earlier. A soft rustle from the bushland drew their attention, A few of the braver children approached, stepping lightly on the warm earth. Their eyes scanned the undergrowth, imagining shapes that might appear, creatures that might emerge. But the forest was calm, still, almost reverent, as if it had absorbed the morning's extraordinary events into its very being. They did not speak aloud, yet a sense of shared understanding passed among them. Each child felt the weight of what they had witnessed, the silence of the crafts, the being's deep, knowing eyes, the telepathic images that had entered their minds. The children sat quietly, letting their senses take in everything around them. They could still feel the presence of the beings, not physically, but as a lingering energy that seemed to connect them to the earth and sky alike. Some imagined the beings moving gracefully through the air, observing with patient curiosity, their intentions gentle and wise. Others remembered the images of dying trees, polluted rivers, and clouds heavy with smoke, feeling a profound sense of responsibility settle in their hearts. Even the sounds of the playground seemed different now. Each laugh, each step, each soft murmur was imbued with a new meaning. The world had grown more intricate, more sensitive, and the children felt as though they were a part of its heartbeat. They spoke in whispers, sharing impressions, feelings, and questions that arose like delicate bubbles. Do they come here often? Why did they choose us? Will we remember this forever? Each thought was carried not just in words, but in a deep, intuitive knowing that connected them all. Time flowed strangely. Minutes felt like hours, and hours like moments. The children's minds lingered on what had occurred, replaying the movements of the crafts, the glint of their silver surfaces, the precise elegance of their patterns. The smaller lights that had danced and twirled were not forgotten, their graceful arcs traced in memory like luminous ribbons in the sky. And above all, the beings Aista immense, dark, and all-knowing iced it in their minds, soft yet intense, conveying wisdom and care without uttering a single word. One child, sitting cross-legged on the soft earth, pressed a hand against the ground, feeling the vibrations of the soil beneath them. It's like the earth is talking, they whispered. Another child nodded, eyes wide. It is. It is alive, in a way I never noticed before. They shared a quiet smile, realizing that this connection was no accident. The beings had shown them a glimpse, a silent lesson, and now it was their choice how deeply to remember, how intentionally to act upon it. The bush seemed to lean in closer, embracing the children's awareness. Leaves shimmered, as if acknowledging their attention, and the birds' song soft-inade, harmonizing with the subtle rhythm of the day. A gentle breeze moved across the field, carrying the faint scent of flowers, earth, and sunlight. Each child felt the pulse of life beneath their feet, a reminder that even the smallest actions mattered. Every choice, every thought, every movement was woven into the fabric of this living, breathing world. And then came the images again, fleeting, vivid. They were not visions imposed from outside, but memories and reflections stirred within the children's own minds. They remembered the beings concerned for the earth, the urgency to care for forests, rivers, and skies. The silent message grew clearer with each moment. Awareness must be followed by action, observation by responsibility. They could feel the weight of it, not as fear, but as purpose. An invisible hand guiding them toward choices that would resonate beyond the morning's light. The children began to experiment with sharing what they had felt. One whispered to another, "I saw the river, all murky and gray. They want us to fix it." Another nodded, speaking softly. "And the trees, they told me to care for them, even when no one is watching." They formed a quiet circle, hands brushing occasionally, eyes meeting with shared understanding. No adult had explained this. No teacher had interpreted it. It was a knowing that came from inside, from the connection they now felt with the sky, the earth, and each other. Even the simplest gestures carried meaning. A hand lifted to point at the horizon, a finger tracing the shapes of clouds, a quiet exhale of breathy, were all ways of acknowledging the presence that had touched them so profoundly. And though the beings were no longer visible, their influence lingered, a quiet hum that resonated within the children, guiding thoughts, shaping understanding, and gently altering perception. The longer they remained in that quiet reflection, the more details emerged. A silver glint from a distant tree reminded them of the craft's surface. A pattern in the grass mirrored the movement of the smaller lights. The children began to see connections everywhere. Shapes, sounds, and rhythms that previously went unnoticed. It was as if the world itself had opened a secret door, inviting them to step inside and observe its delicate intricacies. One child, seated near a sun-dappled patch of grass, whispered, "I feel like they trust us now, like we are part of something bigger." Another nodded slowly, feeling the truth in that thought. The awareness that each action mattered, that care and observation were vital, became a shared understanding among the group. They realized that the morning's visit had given them a gift, a quiet insight into the way life and intelligence intertwined across the world and beyond. As the sun rose higher and the morning matured into midday, the children's reflection did not fade. Instead, it deepened. They noticed subtle movements of insects across the playground, the tiny shift of soil underfoot, the flutter of leaves in a gentle breeze. Each element seemed imbued with importance, connected to the larger story they had glimpsed. It was a world alive, filled with intelligence, subtle messages, and beauty waiting to be noticed. Even as they returned to classrooms and routines, the bushland whispered its quiet secrets. The children carried a sense of calm responsibility, a soft awareness that their observation mattered. They understood that the sky had shown them something profound, a connection, a lesson, and an invitation to act with care. No words were necessary. The feelings were sufficient. They remembered the silver shapes, the elegant movements, and the being's eyes, holding them in quiet reverence, knowing these memories would grow with them through the years. And as the shadows lengthened and the day continued, the children began to talk softly among themselves, sharing impressions, connecting feelings, and forming a silent pact. They would never forget. They would honor the message. They would live with the awareness that even the smallest choice, the quietest action, and the gentlest thought mattered in the delicate, interconnected world that had been revealed to them that morning. By the time the bell rang and called them back indoors, their hearts were full, their minds alive with questions, and their souls touched by something vast and infinite. The playground was ordinary once more, yet everything had changed. The morning at Ariel School had offered a glimpse into the extraordinary, leaving the children forever altered, forever connected, and forever carrying the whispers of the sky within them. Chapter 4. The Eyes That Saw Everything. The playground was quiet now, though the echoes of earlier astonishment still lingered like a soft hum vibrating through the air. The children gathered in small groups, whispering in hushed tones, their voices barely rising above the gentle rustling of the miambo trees that edged the clearing. It was not fear that held them silent, it was awe. A new understanding had settled into their hearts, delicate yet insistent, like sunlight threading its way through the thick canopy above. Their minds kept returning to the eyes. Those eyes, immense and dark, had stared not at them in judgment, but at them in comprehension, as if reaching into the very core of their thoughts, understanding without words, connecting without barriers. Each child carried the memory differently, yet the impact was the same. An unspoken certainty that they had been seen, truly seen, in ways no one else ever could. They spoke to one another in whispers, sharing fragments of their thoughts. "I think they understood us more than we understand ourselves," said one. Another nodded slowly, eyes wide. "It's like they can see the world the way it really is." The children's own perceptions had expanded, sharpened, and deepened. Every leaf, every shadow, every flicker of sunlight became a story to be read, a message to be received. The being's presence lingered in their memories like a soft fragrance that refuses to fade. Some children imagined the figures stepping gently back into their craft, their movements fluid and deliberate. Others remembered how the smaller lights had darted like fireflies across the playground, twisting and turning in impossible arcs that defied understanding. And still, all the while, the eyes remained the eyes that carried intelligence, concern, and quiet guidance. One child, sitting cross-legged on a soft patch of grass, traced a finger along a line of ants marching steadily along the dirt. "I think they were showing us that everything matters," they said softly. Another child leaned closer, watching the tiny creatures with fresh attention. "Even the smallest things," they whispered, "they all count." And in that moment, the children realized that the lesson was not just about what they had seen, but about how they would. carry the memory into every choice, every action, every quiet thought. They began to notice subtler details in their surroundings, ones that had gone unnoticed before. The patterns of sunlight on leaves, the whisper of wind threading through branches, the way shadows shifted with the slow passage of the sun. All of these were now imbued with significance. Each child felt a quiet connection, an invisible thread linking them to the beings, to the sky, and to the earth itself. And then came the images again, soft but vivid, weaving themselves into the children's consciousness. Forests, green and alive, some with leaves brittle and brown, others lush and thriving. Rivers, winding and clear, were stagnant and shadowed. Skies heavy with clouds, and skies brilliant and pure. These were not images of doom, but invitations to notice, to care, to act with awareness. The children felt the weight of responsibility pressing gently, insistently, into their young hearts, and they welcomed it. As they spoke, their voices barely more than whispers. They began to assemble their own understanding of what had happened. They didn't need words, one said. They just showed us. Another child nodded, and we understand. We really understand. In that quiet acknowledgement, a deep sense of empowerment blossomed. The knowledge was theirs to carry, theirs to nurture, and theirs to share. But it was not a burden. It was a gift, a gentle urging to look more closely, care more deeply, and live with purpose. The playground itself seemed to respond. A soft breeze swirled through the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and sunlight. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the grass like dark fingers pointing toward the horizon. Birds moved in arcs, gliding effortlessly above the treetops, and even the smallest insects paused in their diligent work, as if the entire world had collectively exhaled in acknowledgement of the morning's extraordinary events. One child wandered closer to the edge of the bushland, where the grass gave way to rougher terrain. They crouched down, fingertips brushing against the soil, feeling its texture, its warmth, its life. "It's like it's breathing," they whispered. Another child crouched beside them, inhaling the scent of the earth. "It's alive," they said softly. "Everything is alive." The children began to see their surroundings, not as static scenery but as living, responsive, and aware, just as the beings had shown them. The memories of the beings became sharper with each recollection. The way the craft's silver surface glimmered under the sun, the precise and deliberate motion of the smaller lights, the elegance of every gesture. These were images that would never fade. The children could recall the tilt of a head, the curve of a limb, the subtle rhythm of their movements as if they had been etched into their minds by sunlight itself. Each memory carried emotion, awareness, and understanding, making the entire experience not just something they had seen, but something they had felt, lived, and integrated. In quiet moments, the children began to experiment with these sensations. They traced the path of the crafts with their fingers, imagining the curves and angles, feeling the weightless movement as though it existed in their own bodies. They recreated the patterns of the lights in soft arcs, mimicking their dance across the sky. And in these small, silent practices, they discovered something profound. They could feel the rhythm, the intention, and the intelligence behind every motion. The beings' eyes returned to their thoughts, immense and infinite, watching not in judgment, but in understanding. The children could sense a presence that did not require speech, that communicated in pure awareness. One child whispered, "It's like they are telling us to notice everything, to remember everything, to care about everything." Another nodded. "And to remember that it all connects," they said softly. "We are part of it all." The realization spread through the children like sunlight threading through clouds, warm, steady, and illuminating. Time flowed differently as the day continued. Each moment was expanded, layered with detail, emotion, and awareness. The children's attention to the smallest things deepened. They watched ants carry leaves, birds flit between branches, the wind move clouds across the sky, and the subtle shifts of light on leaves. Every detail was a story, every movement a lesson. The playground had become a canvas, a living tapestry that mirrored the intelligence they had glimpsed beyond the horizon. Even ordinary objects gained extraordinary significance. A stick lying in the grass was not just a stick, it was a part of a system, a small but essential detail in a vast and interconnected world. A puddle reflected sunlight, the image of clouds and trees intertwining with water and shadow, teaching balance and perspective, and a fallen leaf became a reminder of cycles, of change, and of impermanence. In every small observation, the children discovered meaning, insight, and responsibility. And as the afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky, the children carried with them the lessons of the morning, woven into their consciousness like invisible threads. They whispered to one another, shared subtle nods and glances, and felt the collective understanding deepen. Even in silence, they were connected to Ichoter, to the sky, to the earth, and to the beings whose eyes had taught them more than words ever could. Every step, every breath, every thought was colored by what they had experienced. The playground had returned to normal, yet nothing would ever feel ordinary again. They had glimpsed intelligence beyond their understanding, lessons beyond language, and a connection that would remain vivid for the rest of their lives. And as the shadows lengthened, the children knew in their hearts that the morning had changed them forever. The world was alive, full of messages, and waiting for them to notice. They had seen the eyes that saw everything, and in that vision, they had learned to look, to listen, and to care in ways that would guide them for years to come. Chapter 5. The Silent Message. After the extraordinary events of the morning, the children returned to their classrooms with a quiet reverence that seemed to cloak the entire school. The walls, the desks, and the familiar sounds of pencils scratching on paper felt different now, charged with a subtle energy. Something had shifted not just in the air, but in the children themselves. They were no longer simply students at a small school in Rua. They were witnesses, custodians of a secret, guardians of a message that had arrived without words yet spoke more clearly than any spoken language. The images from the encounter continued to unfold in their minds. They could still feel the presence of the beings, their silent watchfulness, their calm observation. But now, as the morning's excitement subsided, the children began to notice the depth of what had been communicated. It was not a simple warning or a fleeting spectacle. It was a message carried in emotions, sensations, and images that transcended ordinary understanding. It was as if the beings had reached directly into their consciousness, planting seeds of awareness that would grow slowly but surely. Some children tried to put their experience into words, but found language insufficient. "I don't know how to say it," one whispered to a friend, eyes wide. "It's like they showed us." Another nodded, struggling with the same limitation. "Yes, it's not words, but we understand." Their shared understanding was profound, unspoken yet deeply felt. Each child had glimpsed something that could not be captured fully in sentences, something that belonged to the realm of intuition, perception, and the soul. In the quiet of the classrooms, they began to draw, paper after paper, crayon and pencil moving swiftly across the surface, capture the shapes of the crafts, the proportions of the beings, and the gestures that had conveyed so much. Each drawing was unique, yet unmistakably similar in essence. The silver shapes, the smaller lights, the enormous black eyes all were represented with astonishing consistency. Even the tiniest details, curve of a limb, the shimmer of metal, the pattern of movement were repeated across dozens of drawings, suggesting not imagination or copying, but a shared, genuine memory etched into each young mind. The drawings were not just representations. They were expressions of emotion, understanding, and awareness. Some children illustrated the images they had received telepathically. The withering trees, the polluted waters, the skies heavy with smoke. Others drew scenes of balance, of life flourishing, of forests and rivers untouched. The images spoke volumes, conveying a message of responsibility, stewardship, and the delicate balance between humans and their environment. Each stroke of the pencil was a testament to the power of memory, perception, and attention. Even the children who had not been directly closest to the crafts or the beings felt the message resonating within them. It moved quietly through the groups, a subtle thread linking all 62 witnesses. They whispered to one another, sharing what they felt and sensed, connecting emotions like invisible cords of understanding. "We have to take care," one said softly. "We have to remember." Another added, "Yes, it's about the earth, about everything we touch." In these moments, a profound collective consciousness began to emerge, guided not by fear, but by a gentle, insistent awareness of responsibility. The playground itself seemed to acknowledge this quiet transformation. The sunlight shifted subtly as clouds passed overhead, casting fleeting patterns across the grass. Birds paused in mid-flight, singing notes that seemed attuned to the children's heightened sensitivity. Even the smallest insects carried an unspoken rhythm, as if the entire environment had been touched by the intelligence that had visited them. The children felt this awareness, noticing connections that had been invisible before. Every motion, every sound, every glimmer of light carried meaning now. Some children closed their eyes, recalling the being's presence and the feelings they had inspired. They could feel the hum of energy that had lingered, a vibration that seemed to connect them directly to the earth and sky alike. One child whispered, "It's like they're showing us the threads that connect everything, how even small things matter." Another nodded, adding softly, "And that it's not just about what we see. It's about what we feel, what we understand, and what we do with it." The message, dug silent, was alive, growing within each child, guiding their attention and shaping their understanding. As the day progressed, the children found themselves reflecting on ordinary things with extraordinary clarity. The way sunlight filtered through leaves, the arc of a bird's flight, the curve of a river in the distance, all were imbued with significance. They began to see patterns, to recognize the interconnectedness of life, and to sense the consequences of human actions on the natural world. The images they had received were not threats, but invitations to notice, to care, to act with consciousness and awareness. Even the simplest gestures carried weight. A child tracing a line of ants along the soil, another observing the ripple of water in a puddle, and yet another noting the pattern of shadows on the playground all, were participating in a quiet dialogue with the environment. The morning's encounter had awakened senses that had previously lain dormant, allowing them to perceive subtle connections, to recognize the life force within every element, and to understand the ripple effects of every action. The teachers, when they returned to the playground, noticed a shift. The children moved with an unusual stillness, a focused attention that was both unusual and profound. Questions were asked softly, observations shared quietly, and the energy of the group had changed, even without knowing the full story. It was clear that something extraordinary had occurred, something that had altered the children's perception of the world around them. And as they walked back into classrooms, carrying their drawings and shared reflections, the children began to internalize the silent message more fully. They understood that the being's visit was not a spectacle or a game, but a deliberate communication. It was a call to awareness, a gentle urging to notice the subtle, the overlooked, the interconnectedness of life. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Care, observe, act with understanding, and recognize that every choice matters. Throughout the day, the children found moments of quiet reflection, often glancing toward the bushland where the crafts had hovered. They could still feel the echoes of presence there, subtle yet unmistakable. The memory of the eyes, the light, and the silent communication remained vivid, guiding thoughts and shaping perceptions. Even in play, they were more mindful, noticing the patterns of nature, the flow of movement, and the delicate balance of life around them. And as the sun began its descent, casting a warm glow across the school grounds, the children felt a sense of calm responsibility settle over them. They had received a message, clear and silent, and it was now theirs to honor. Every action, every choice, every small attention to the world mattered. They had glimpsed intelligence and care beyond their understanding, and now they were tasked with carrying that awareness into the everyday moments of life. By the end of the day, the children had woven the silent message into the very fabric of their being. It was not spoken aloud, yet it resonated in every glance, every breath, and every step. They knew that this message would remain with them for years to come, guiding their thoughts, shaping their understanding, and inspiring actions that honored the connection between humans, the earth, and the wider world beyond. The morning had been extraordinary, the hours that followed transformative. And as the children left the school grounds hand in hand with a quiet awareness, they carried within them a seed planted by beings whose eyes saw everything, a seed that would grow into insight, responsibility, and a lifelong understanding of the delicate balance of life. Chapter 6. The Whispered Warnings. The morning had passed, but the quiet hum of curiosity and awareness lingered in every corner of the Ariel School playground. Even as the children returned to their classrooms, their hearts carried the weight of what had occurred. It was not a heavy weight, no more like a gentle pressure, a persistent pulse reminding them that something extraordinary had touched their lives and would continue to shape them in ways both subtle and profound. The images they had received from the beings replayed in their minds like scenes from a dream, vivid and detailed. The silver crafts, hovering silently, reflected sunlight in ways that made the air itself shimmer. The smaller, darting lights moved in impossible patterns, and the beings, teeny in stature but enormous in presence, stood with a quiet patience, observing and conveying without words. Their black, almond-shaped eyes, so large and expressive, seemed to carry not only knowledge but concern, a delicate sadness for what they had witnessed in the world around them. It was the concern that resonated most deeply with the children. The telepathic impressions, although silent and wordless, spoke with clarity and purpose. Images of withered trees, polluted rivers, and smoke-filled skies had entered their consciousness. It was not fear that the beings wished to instill, but understanding, a quiet urging to observe, reflect, and eventually act. The children could feel the weight of the message pressing gently upon them, a whispered call to recognize the fragility of their environment and their role within it. As the children shared their experiences in hushed tones, they began to notice patterns in their memories. One whispered to another, "Do you remember the way the trees looked? The ones in the images?" The other nodded slowly. "Yes, and the rivers, too. They were telling us to care." Each child pieced together fragments, creating a collective understanding that was richer than any single memory alone. Their small voices intertwined, carrying wisdom that had been conveyed without a single spoken word. Even their senses seemed sharpened. The rustle of leaves in the wind became a song of life and interconnection. The sunlight filtering through branches painted stories on the ground. A butterfly, pausing delicately on a flower, seemed to embody the very lessons the beings had shared. The children noticed these details with new clarity, as if their minds had been attuned to subtleties that had always been present but previously overlooked. They were learning to see the world as it truly was, alive, intricate, and full of meaning. One child sat cross-legged on a patch of grass, fingertips tracing the grooves of bark on a nearby tree. "It's like they're showing us that every part matters," they whispered. Another leaned closer, eyes wide, and added, "Even the tiniest things, every leaf, every stone, every drop of water, it all counts." The realization spread through the children quietly, but insistently, each understanding reinforcing the other. The morning's encounter had left them with more than memories. It had left them with insight and a newfound responsibility. The being's message was not limited to images alone. Emotions, subtle and profound, had accompanied every impression. The children recalled the sadness in the eyes, a sadness not directed at them personally but at the world they shared. They felt empathy awaken within themselves, a recognition that the earth, the sky, the water, and every living creature deserved care, attention, and respect. It was a gentle awakening, a realization that responsibility and love were intertwined, and that their actions could have ripple effects far beyond what they could see. Throughout the day, these impressions guided their thoughts, even during ordinary activities. As they drew, played, or listened to lessons, the memories lingered, shaping perceptions and responses. When one child noticed a puddle reflecting sunlight, they remarked quietly, "Look how beautiful it is. We should keep it that way." Another observed a bird hopping along the ground and whispered, "Even small creatures matter." In this way, the message became part of the fabric of their everyday awareness, embedding itself naturally and gently into their consciousness. Some children began to experiment with expressing what they had felt. They tried writing notes, sketching images, and arranging patterns in the sand that reflected what they had experienced. Their drawings grew more detailed, their sketches more deliberate, their patterns more meaningful. Each child found their own way to communicate what words could not fully capture. The playground, once just a space for play, had transformed into a canvas for expression, reflection, and understanding. The whispers of the being's warnings were also evident in the way the children interacted with each other. There was a quiet patience, an attentiveness, a willingness to listen that had not existed before. Conflicts and squabbles were replaced with cooperation and understanding. Questions were asked not to dominate a conversation, but to seek insight. Observations were shared to illuminate, not to impress. The silent lessons had shaped not only how the children perceived the world, but how they related to one another, fostering a subtle but profound sense of community. Even as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the playground, the children felt a sense of continuity between the images and their environment. The larger craft, hovering silently in their memories, seemed to echo in the way sunlight touched the leaves. The smaller lights, darting in impossible arcs, reflected in the patterns of insects and birds. The presence of the beings lingered in a subtle, invisible way, guiding awareness and shaping thought. Each child felt this connection uniquely, yet all shared a common understanding of its significance. The telepathic impressions carried lessons about balance, care, and mindfulness. The children understood that the world's ecosystems were delicate, and that human actions had consequences that extended far beyond immediate perception. They remembered the images of polluted skies and dying trees, and the feelings of sorrow the beings had conveyed. It was not a message of despair, but of possibility and invitation to act with understanding, to nurture life, and to honor the interconnectedness of all things. Some of the children felt compelled to record their thoughts immediately. They wrote down phrases, sentences, and observations that captured their impressions. Others drew again, creating images that reflected both the beings' forms and the environmental warnings they had shared. Each act of expression became a way to solidify understanding, to make the silent message tangible, and to share it in ways that could be remembered and reflected upon for years to come. Even ordinary movements and gestures took on new significance. A child picking up a fallen leaf would notice its structure, its veins, and the way it had interacted with sunlight and rain. Another child watching ants march in a line would appreciate the rhythm and coordination, understanding that even the smallest life forms were part of a greater system. These were quiet lessons, absorbed naturally through observation and awareness, each contributing to a growing comprehension of the world's intricate balance. As the day wore on, the children carried the silent warnings with them wherever they went. They were aware not just of what they had seen, but of how it applied to every aspect of their water, air, plants, animals, and even interactions with each other became infused with a deeper awareness. They began to notice the subtle interplay between cause and effect, action and consequence, thought and outcome. The being's message was becoming internalized, living within them as a gentle, guiding force. The day ended with a quiet sense of completion. The playground, once ordinary and familiar, had been transformed in the children's minds into a space of observation, reflection, and connection. The whispers of the being's warnings had settled into their consciousness, like soft currents guiding thought and action. Every detail, from the shimmering light on the leaves to the patterns of movement in the sky, had taken on new significance. They had glimpsed intelligence and care beyond their comprehension, and they carried it forward with humility, curiosity, and reverence. By the end of the day, the children had woven the silent message into their understanding. It was no longer simply an experience of the morning, but a lasting awareness, a consciousness that would influence their perceptions, choices, and interactions. They had received a gift of insight, quiet yet profound, and it was theirs to honor, explore, and share in ways that went beyond words. The beings had not returned, yet their presence remained. It was in the way the wind stirred the leaves, in the patterns of sunlight across the playground, in the movement of animals and insects, and in the quiet, attentive hearts of the children themselves. The silent warnings had been given, received, and understood, and the children, carrying that awareness with them, were ready to begin the delicate work of noticing, caring, and living in harmony with the world around them. Chapter 7. The Patterns of Light. The morning had settled into memory, but its echoes were alive in every detail around the Ariel School. As the children moved through the playground, classrooms, and quiet corridors, they felt the subtle rhythm of what had unfolded earlier. The presence of the crafts, the beings, and their silent communication had shifted the way the children perceived motion, light, and the very space they occupied. Some of them paused in the shade of the mayambo trees, tracing their fingers along bark or tilting their heads to follow the flight of a bird. Movement. Each observation seemed to echo the patterns they had seen in the sky. The smaller lights, darting and twisting with precision and grace, had left impressions not just on memory, but on perception itself. The children began to see rhythm in the motion of everything from falling leaves to the slow drift of clouds across the sunlit sky. One child, squatting by a patch of grass, watched shadows ripple and stretch as the breeze moved through the trees. "It's like they're still here," they whispered, eyes fixed on the play of light and dark. Another child crouched beside them, following the movement of sunlight glinting off a puddle. "The patterns," they said softly. "They re-steal. In everything we see, the subtle repetition, the dance of light and shadow, became a gentle reminder of the being's presence and the lessons they had conveyed." The children began to draw connections between what they had observed in the sky and the natural world around them. The arcs of sunlight glinting on leaves mirrored the fluid motions of the smaller lights. The sway of tree branches resembled the subtle movements of the being's gestures. Even the sounds, the rustle of leaves, the hum of insects, the distant chatter of birds, took on a rhythm that seemed intentionally aligned with the patterns they had seen. Every detail felt interconnected, every motion imbued with meaning. In quiet corners, the children experimented with recreating the patterns of light and movement. Some traced lines in the dirt, mimicking the arcs of the smaller crafts. Others arranged leaves or stones into shapes that reflected the geometry of the hovering crafts. Each child's work was unique, yet all reflected a consistent understanding of motion, flow, and rhythm. In these exercises, they discovered that they could feel the intelligence behind the movements, sensing a deliberate grace that had inspired awe during the encounter. The eyes of the beings remained vivid in the children's minds. Each child could recall their immense, black almond shapes, the way they conveyed understanding, concern, and knowledge without words. "They were watching us," one child said softly to a friend, but it didn't feel like spying. It felt like teaching. Another nodded slowly, adding, "Yes, teaching through seeing, through showing, without needing words." This understanding became a touchstone, a framework for how the children approached their day, their observations, and their interactions. As the afternoon sun arced higher, the children began to notice subtler patterns. Leaves fluttered in sequences that resembled the motions of the crafts. Clouds drifted in formations that mirrored the trajectory of the smaller lights. Even the tiny movements of insects, ants, marching in rhythm, reflected an underlying order. The children felt a profound connection, as if the world itself had adopted the lessons of the being's visit, revealing intelligence, balance, and harmony in everything they observed. The playground became a laboratory for exploration. Children observed the shapes and angles of shadows, the glint of sunlight on different surfaces, the reflections in puddles, and the way light filtered through the branches. Each observation was accompanied by a quiet discussion. "It's all connected," one whispered. "Even the smallest reflection matters." Another added, "We can see patterns in everything if we pay attention." These discussions were not loud or insistent, they were gentle, contemplative, and deeply respectful of the insights the children had received. Even ordinary school tasks were transformed. During lessons, children traced diagrams with new attention, noticing angles and proportions. During play, they mirrored movements, exploring arcs and rotations inspired by the lights. The rhythms of daily activity became extensions of what they had learned, subtle exercises in awareness, focus, and perception. Every movement, every gesture, carried a potential lesson if approached with intention and attention. The being's silent communication continued to influence not just observation, but understanding. The images and impressions they had conveyed, the warnings about environmental neglect, the illustrations of technological hubris, the visions of balance and flourishing were now interpreted through the patterns the children observed in nature. The shapes of light, motion, and reflection were not merely aesthetic. They were messages, teaching tools, and reminders of the intelligence behind the world they inhabited. In small clusters, the children experimented with creating sequences that reflected the patterns they had noticed. They moved sticks, leaves, and stones into arcs and lines, arranging colors, shapes, and textures to replicate the motions of the crafts and lights. Each arrangement was an interpretation, a visual language that mirrored what they had felt and understood. In doing so, they realized that learning did not require words alone. Shapes and sequences could communicate as clearly, if not more profoundly. Tongue language. Even during quiet reflection, the children felt the presence of the beings guiding them, subtle and gentle, like a whisper carried on the breeze. Notice the small things, one child murmured to another. Feel the connections. Another replied, it's everywhere, in the light, the movement, the world itself. This awareness, cultivated through observation and practice, became a source of both wonder and responsibility. The children understood that these lessons were not temporary. They were to be carried forward, integrated into the way they perceived and interacted with the world. The silver crafts, hovering silently in memory, became a reference point for every new observation. Their sleek, reflective surfaces, precise contours, and calculated movements inspired children to look for elegance and order in nature. The smaller darting lights inspired curiosity, experimentation, and attention to detail. And the beings themselves, ever patient and observant, became silent men, teaching the children through presence, motion, and the delicate interplay of light and shadow. By late afternoon, the children had woven the lessons of the morning into a continuous, living experience. Every glance at the trees, every ripple of sunlight, every motion of animals and insects carried significance. They had internalized the patterns of light and movement, translating them into a personal language of observation, awareness, and empathy. The playground, classrooms, and surrounding bushland had become more than familiar space. They had become landscapes of insight, reflection, and connection. Even as the school day ended, the children were reluctant to leave the playground. They lingered observing patterns in the shifting light, noting how shadows danced across the grass, and how reflections appeared and disappeared in puddles. It's still happening, one whispered, even though they're gone. Another nodded. The lessons, the patterns, they never left. In this quiet understanding, the children recognized the enduring impact of the being's visit. As they walked home, hand in hand or in small groups, the children continued to discuss what they had observed. They noticed shapes in clouds, arcs in the flight of birds, and reflections on water. Each observation became a reminder of the morning's encounter, a living embodiment of the silent teachings they had received. The patterns of light were no longer just visual phenomena, they were messages, guides, and companions, carrying wisdom that transcended words. By the end of the day, the children had discovered something profound, that the world itself was a living, intelligent tapestry, full of rhythms, patterns, and connections. The lessons of the beings had transformed perception, teaching them to notice, to observe, and to care with intention. Every motion, every reflection, every subtle shift in light carried meaning. And the children, attuned now to these patterns, were ready to carry that awareness forward, integrating it into their lives and sharing it with others in quiet, thoughtful ways. The sky above Rua remained calm, serene, and infinite. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the school grounds. The children, filled with new understanding, glanced upward, remembering the silver crafts, the smaller lights, and the eyes that had seen everything. They knew that the patterns of light, the silent warnings, and the lessons woven into every movement would stay with them, guiding perception, action, and awareness for years to come. Chapter 8. Shadows and Questions. The afternoon had waned, and the golden light of the sun cast long, gentle shadows across the Ariel School playground. The children moved slowly, absorbed in thoughts and feelings that were both new and profound. The earlier encounter with the crafts and beings had shifted something deep inside them, a quiet awakening that made ordinary sights, sounds, and movements suddenly seem more meaningful. Some children lingered near the edges of the playground, watching shadows stretch and bend with the changing sun. They noticed the way light filtered through the leaves, creating intricate patterns that danced on the ground. It was as if the natural world had become a living canvas, responding to their gaze with subtle, deliberate beauty. These shadows were not frightening, they were inviting, like a gentle puzzle waiting to be understood. The children felt drawn to them, sensing an unspoken connection between the lessons of the beings and the rhythms of the natural world. Questions began to surface, delicate and insistent. Why did they come to us? One child whispered. Another replied softly, maybe they wanted us to see what we've been missing, what we need to care for. The questions were not urgent, nor were they laden with fear. They were the natural result of curiosity and reflection, a desire to understand the why behind the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Each question was like a small key, unlocking further insight, prompting observation, and fostering deeper thought. The children began to notice subtler details they had not registered during the initial encounter. A glint of sunlight on a puddle reminded them of the silvery shine of the crafts. The rhythmic sway of branches mirrored the motion of the smaller lights they had seen darting and twisting overhead. Even the gentle hum of insects, previously unnoticed, seemed to carry a pattern, a quiet signal that resonated with the images and feelings the beings had conveyed. Each observation became a piece of the larger puzzle, a way to connect the extraordinary with the everyday. In small groups, the children discussed these observations in low, thoughtful tones. It's like they're teaching us to notice things, one child said. Even the smallest movements have meaning. Another added, and they're showing us that everything is connected: the sky, the trees, the water, even us. These conversations were careful and reflective, revealing a depth of thought unusual for children so young. Yet there was no pretense, no pressure, just the natural unfolding of awareness, curiosity, and wonder. The shadows themselves became subjects of fascination. The children traced them with their fingers, noticing how they lengthened, shortened, and shifted with the movement of the sun. They drew shapes in the dirt to replicate what they observed, experimenting with angles and lines to capture the delicate geometry of natural light and shadow. Each act of creation was a reflection, a meditation, and a way to internalize the lessons they had received. In this way, observation became practice, and practice became understanding. Questions continued to emerge, growing slightly bolder with each passing hour. Do you think they will come back? One child asked. Or were they just here for today? The answer was not known, and perhaps it never would be. Yet the children understood that the value of the experience was not tied to repetition or return. It was in the noticing, the understanding, and the reflection that followed the subtle reshaping of perception and awareness that could continue long after the beings had vanished from sight. Some children felt a strong pull to document their thoughts and observations. They wrote sentences in notebooks, sketched images in the margins, and recorded sequences of light and movement in simple charts. Others created patterns in the sand, arranging sticks, leaves, and stones to replicate what they had seen and felt. Each method was a personal expression, a way to make the invisible tangible, and a bridge between imagination and reality. These practices were not assignments. They were natural extensions of curiosity and engagement, small acts of witnessing that reinforced insight and understanding. The playground became a space of quiet exploration, where shadows and questions intertwined. Children experimented with moving objects to observe changing patterns of light. They whispered observations to each other, sharing discoveries and insights. Look how the shadow bends, one said. It's just like the light arcs we saw before. Another responded, yes, it's a pattern. It's everywhere if we pay attention. The dialogue was gentle and encouraging, fostering collaboration and shared understanding without the need for authority or instruction. Even during ordinary moments, the children felt the lingering presence of the beings. Their memory was alive in every glance, every movement, and every observation. The teachings had been subtle, conveyed through images, feelings, and patterns rather than words, yet their impact was undeniable. The children's perception of the world had expanded, and with it came a sense of responsibility, care, and quiet reverence for the intricate systems of life that surrounded them. The shadows also prompted reflection on contrast and change. Children noticed the difference between sunlight and shade, brightness and dimness, stillness and movement. They understood that these contrasts were part of the lessons they had received: the balance of elements, the interplay of forces, and the awareness that life was composed of interdependent components. Even small differences were meaningful, teaching them to observe carefully and think deeply about what they saw. As the day continued, children began to consider the implications of what they had observed. "If we notice these patterns," one child mused, "then maybe we can help protect them." Another added, "It's like they wanted us to care, not just watch." The whispers of responsibility grew quietly, but persistently, echoing the emotions they had felt during the encounter. The being's message was not fear, but understanding, a call to attentiveness, empathy, and thoughtful action. Even play was transformed by these insights. Children moved with more awareness, noticing the rhythms in their own movements, the spacing of steps, and the interaction of bodies in motion. Games became exercises in observation and reflection, each action an extension of the principles they had learned. The playground itself became a laboratory of discovery, a space where curiosity could be exercised safely and thoughtfully, and where the children could integrate the lessons of the beings into the rhythms of everyday life. By late afternoon, the questions remained, but they were no longer urgent or anxious. They were part of a continuous dialogue, a gentle exploration of meaning, purpose, and connection. The children understood that not every answer was immediate, that understanding often unfolded slowly, and that the process of observation, reflection, and documentation was itself a form of learning. Each question became a doorway, each shadow a guide, and each movement a lesson waiting to be discovered. In this way, the patterns of light and shadow became inseparable from the questions that arose in the children's minds. Observation, reflection, and inquiry formed a continuous loop, reinforcing awareness, empathy, and curiosity. The being's influence was subtle yet profound, teaching through presence, example, and silent guidance. The children had learned to see, to feel, and to reflect, and those lessons were now woven into every aspect of their perception. By the end of the day, the children had discovered something extraordinary, that the world itself was alive with patterns, rhythms, and messages. Shadows and light, motion and stillness, all carried meaning for those who paid attention. The beings had shown them not only the beauty and complexity of their environment, but also the importance of observation, understanding, and care. And the children, attentive and reflective, were ready to carry those lessons forward, transforming ordinary experiences into opportunities for insight, empathy, and mindful action. Chapter 9. Messages in Silence. As the sun climbed toward its peak and began to tilt toward afternoon, the children at Ariel School carried with them an awareness that seemed to hum beneath the surface of everything they did. It was as if the morning's events had unfolded not just in the sky above, but also inside them, quietly altering the way they perceived, listened, and understood the world. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow stretching across the playground, every distant bird call seemed infused with meninga rhythm waiting to be interpreted. Even in the classroom, the atmosphere was charged with a subtle intensity. The children could not speak plainly of what they had experienced, for the adults were largely unaware, and the language to describe such events did not exist in their vocabulary. Yet the memory of the crafts, the beings, and the silent messages lingered, shaping gestures, expressions, and attention. Their minds were filled with images and feelings, each carrying fragments of knowledge, warnings, and understanding. The beings had communicated without words, yet the clarity of the message was undeniable. The children remembered the sorrowful eyes, the gestures, the precise movements of the smaller lights, and the reflective silver of the main craft. They recalled the impressions of polluted skies, withered trees, and waters troubled by unseen hands. It was not a voice that spoke, nor were their words written across the sky. The communication had come directly into their minds, subtle yet vivid, carrying a depth of meaning that required reflection to understand. Sitting together under the shade of a tree, a group of children began to attempt a verbal reconstruction of the silent messages. "It was like they wanted us to know," one whispered, eyes wide, "to understand what is happening to the earth." Another nodded, adding softly, "Not just to see, but to feel. And now we carry that feeling with us." Their words were tentative, exploratory, and careful, as though speaking aloud might dilute the purity of the experience. Yet sharing thoughts in this gentle way helped the children solidify and integrate the silent messages they had received. The messages themselves were not just warnings. They were invitations. They invited observation, attention, reflection, and care. The children understood, even at their young age, that the earth was fragile, delicate, and interconnected. Every tree, river, and creature was part of a vast system that required thoughtfulness to maintain. The silent communications emphasized empathy, teaching the children that every action had consequences, every choice mattered, and that even small gestures could ripple outward with impact. Curiosity blossomed alongside understanding. The children began to ask questions in hushed, contemplative tones. "Why us?" one asked, fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. Another replied, "Maybe because we can see, maybe because we notice." These questions were not idle. They reflected the children's growing awareness that insight was a responsibility. Understanding carried weight, even in silence, and the children felt the subtle but persistent urging of the beings to carry knowledge gently, thoughtfully, and with awareness of its importance. Even the smallest details took on extraordinary significance. A dewdrop glinting in the sunlight became a miniature reflection of the crafts. A butterfly hovering over a flower mirrored the delicate motion of the smaller lights. Leaves rustling in the breeze traced patterns reminiscent of the being's gestures. Each observation reinforced the children's sense of connection with the lessons conveyed, and they began to see that these messages were embedded not just in memory but in the environment itself. Some children began to experiment with documenting these observations, creating charts, sketches, and simple patterns that reflected both the natural world and the impressions they had received. One child arranged stones in the sand to mimic the arcs of light observed in the smaller crafts. Another sketched trees, rivers, and skies, annotating each image with feelings and observations. The act of recording and replicating these impressions was itself a form of learning, helping the children internalize meaning, retain clarity, and integrate abstract messages into tangible, comprehensible forms. The silence of the beings was a lesson in itself. Words were unnecessary, yet the communication was profound. The children discovered that observation, attention, and reflection could speak more clearly than language. They understood that meaning could be conveyed through presence, through emotion, and through patterns, and that sometimes the quietest forms of communication carried the greatest significance. It was an insight that would influence them not only that day, but for many years to come. Even as they moved through ordinary activities, the children felt the echo of the silent messages guiding them. During lessons, they noticed the symmetry in shapes, the flow in sequences, and the balance in forms. During play, they observed patterns in motion, rhythm, and timing. Every act became an extension of awareness, a subtle practice in mindfulness and attentiveness. In this way, the lessons from the beings became woven into every aspect of their lives, subtle yet enduring. As afternoon turned toward evening, the children reflected on what the silent messages meant for their understanding of the world. "It's not just about trees or rivers," one whispered, tracing lines in the sand. "It's about everything we touch, everything we see, everything we do." Another added, "They're showing us that we are connected to everything." The gravity of the lesson was profound, yet it was delivered gently, without fear, and with an invitation to observe, reflect, and act thoughtfully. The power of silence also taught patience. The children realized that understanding did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, like patterns revealed only when sunlight strikes at the perfect angle, or when shadows stretch just so across the playground. They learned that careful attention, repeated observation, and reflection were essential to fully grasp the depth of the being's communication. It was not immediate knowledge, but wisdom cultivated over time. Even small disagreements or confusions among the children were met with gentle resolution. Conversations emphasized understanding over argument. Questions were explored rather than dismissed. Every exchange became an opportunity to deepen awareness, reinforce lessons, and strengthen bonds among the children. In this environment, the lessons of the beings were not just external. They were internalized, becoming part of the children's approach to communication, observation, and empathy. The silent messages also encouraged creativity. Children imagined new ways of representing what they had seen and felt. They created visual patterns in dirt and sand, traced sequences of movement, and crafted miniature representations of the crafts and lights. Some wrote short phrases or feelings in notebooks, capturing the emotional essence of the impressions. Others simply observed, letting understanding settle quietly into their consciousness. Each approach was valid, and each reinforced the lessons embedded in the morning's encounter. By evening, the children began to sense a continuity between the silent messages and their daily lives. Small acts of care, tidying a corner, observing a plant, sharing a thought, took on new meaning. They understood that the beings had not just provided images, but had taught a way of seeing, feeling, and interacting with the world. The experience had shifted perception, teaching attention, empathy, and responsibility. And the children carried these lessons with them, naturally, quietly, and persistently. The sky above Rua darkened gently, turning shades of violet and indigo. The children, walking home or gathering with family, glanced upward, remembering the hovering crafts, the darting lights, and the eyes that had conveyed so much without speaking. They understood that the messages in silence were enduring, that observation was a form of communication, and that their role as witnesses extended beyond that day, beyond that moment, and into every encounter with the world around them. By the end of the day, the children had discovered something extraordinary, that silence could be louder than words, that observation could be as instructive as language, and that understanding could be conveyed through presence, patterns, and emotion. The being's visit had been brief, yet it left a profound imprint, a quiet awareness that would grow and deepen as the children continued to notice, reflect, and act with care. The lessons of the silent messages were now part of them, woven into their perception, attention, and thought. Every leaf, shadow, reflection, and motion carried meaning. Every small observation was a reminder that the world was alive, intelligent, and interconnected, and the children, attentive and curious, were ready to carry those lessons forward, integrating them into their lives, their choices, and the way they related to the world and each other. Chapter 10. The Ripple of Understanding. As the days passed after the encounter at Ariel School, the children began to notice subtle shifts in the world around them. The experience had etched itself into their consciousness, like a quiet rhythm running beneath every sound, every sight, every thought. It was no longer only about the crafts or the beings. They were learning to perceive patterns, connections, and meanings in ways that transcended ordinary observation. The playground, once a simple space of games and chatter, had transformed into a laboratory of reflection. Children paused to notice shadows stretching across the grass, the glint of sunlight on leaves, and the arcs of wind moving through branches. They began to anticipate the gentle movements of birds, to notice the cadence of footsteps, and to observe the interactions of insects with a precision they had not known before. Every detail, every motion, became a lesson, and every lesson was a ripple of understanding spreading quietly through their minds. This ripple of understanding was not sudden, it was slow, deliberate, and layered. The children discovered that they could trace connections between what they had seen in the sky and what existed on the ground. The darting lights mirrored patterns in the trees. The subtle curves of the crafts reflected arcs and shadows. The beings' gestures resonated with the rhythm of daily life. Each observation reinforced the impression that the universe was interconnected, that every element, no matter how small, played a role in the greater whole. In classrooms, the lessons continued subtly. Teachers noticed that some children had become more attentive, more thoughtful, and more reflective. Their curiosity was directed not only toward academics, but also toward the world around them. Questions flowed more freely, often inspired by observation rather than instruction. "Why does the sunlight fall like this?" one child asked, tracing a pattern on the floor. "Does it always move in this rhythm?" Another answered softly, "Maybe it's showing us something, like the crafts did." Their conversation revealed the internalization of a unique comprehension that extended beyond words into the realm of perception itself. The children also began to notice emotional echoes of the encounter. The beings had conveyed feelings, concern, empathy, a quiet urgency without words. Now, those feelings surfaced naturally in the children's interactions with each other. They were gentler, more patient, more aware of the needs and emotions of their peers. Conflicts were resolved with quiet discussion rather than loud argument. Cooperation and attentiveness became instinctive, and the children realized that the lessons of the beings were not only about observation but about care, connection, and respect. Some of the children turned their attention to creative expression as a way to process the encounter. They drew detailed sketches of the crafts, lights, and beings, not as a record, but as a meditation. They arranged objects, patterns, and lines in sand and dirt to mirror what they had seen. Others wrote short reflections or stories inspired by the emotions and impressions of the morning. Each creative act reinforced understanding, translating experience into a tangible form that could be revisited, shared, and reflected upon. The ripple of understanding extended beyond mere observation and documentation. The children began to make small choices that reflected a heightened awareness of their environment. They noticed when a tree branch was broken or when a puddle had become stagnant. They considered how their actions might affect the world around them, even in minor ways. They understood, in ways that were subtle but profound, that the lessons imparted by the beings were not just for noticing, they were for caring, for influencing the world positively, even through small, thoughtful actions. In quiet moments, the children contemplated the broader meaning of the messages. They thought about the state of the earth, the balance of ecosystems, and the impact of human technology. The warnings they had received in silent communication images of polluted skies, dying trees, and struggling wildlife emerged in their thoughts with clarity. The ripple of understanding was now intertwined with responsibility. Awareness without action was incomplete, and they felt a growing sense of purpose in how they interacted with the world. Conversations among the children reflected this deeper comprehension. "It's not just about noticing," one child said softly. "It's about making things better." Another added, "Even small actions can matter, like cleaning a river or planting a tree." They realized that the beings had not come to scare or control them. They had come to teach them awareness, empathy, and the power of conscious choice. The ripple of understanding was not passive. It was actively influencing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in subtle, enduring ways. As the sun continued its arc across the sky, the children observed not only patterns of light, but also patterns of movement, interaction, and life. The rhythm of birds in flight, the dance of leaves in the breeze, and the quiet organization of ants along a path all mirrored the precision and grace of the crafts they had seen. These patterns were not random. They carried order, intelligence, and meaning. The children learned to interpret them, to feel them, and to integrate them into their understanding of the world. Even routine tasks became imbued with significance. Sweeping the playground, arranging classroom materials, or walking along the path to the tuck shop were approached with intention. Children noticed details, adjusted their movements to flow with rhythm, and applied lessons from observation to everyday life. They had internalized the message that mindfulness and care were essential, and that awareness of patterns could guide behavior, enrich perception, and foster connection with both people and the environment. The ripple of understanding was strengthened by collective experience. When children shared observations, sketches, or reflections, they expanded each other's awareness. Ideas spread quietly through conversation, enhancing insight and reinforcing the significance of what they had experienced. Shared observation created a web of attention and reflection, where each child contributed to a communal understanding that was greater than the sum of individual experiences. Even in moments of rest, the children continued to feel the influence of the being's visit. Shadows cast across the playground, sunlight filtering through the trees, and patterns in water or leaves became reminders of the lessons they had received. Their perception was now attuned to subtleties, and every glance, every touch, every movement carried the potential for insight. Awareness was no longer optional. It had become a way of being, quietly guiding thought, action, and reflection. By the end of the day, the ripple of understanding had deepened. The children realized that observation, reflection, and action were interconnected. Awareness carried responsibility, curiosity encouraged mindfulness, and subtle attention could reveal profound truths. The morning's encounter had been brief, yet its impact was enduring. The being's teachings were now embedded in perception, in behavior, and in the quiet consciousness of the children, who had become carriers of a silent wisdom, subtle yet potent. The sky above Rua glowed in the evening light, soft and expansive, and the children paused. looking upward with a sense of reverence and contemplation. They remembered the silver crafts, the smaller lights, and the beings who had communicated not with words, but with presence, intention, and subtle patterns. The ripple of understanding had begun as a quiet impression, but had now extended into thought, action, and reflection, guiding the children as they carried their awareness forward into every interaction, every observation, and every choice. The day concluded with a sense of quiet accomplishment and insight. Children spoke in low, thoughtful tones, revisiting observations, refining patterns, and sharing reflections. They had internalized lessons without being explicitly taught, guided by intuition, curiosity, and the silent communication of the beings. The ripple of understanding had transformed perception, deepened empathy, and instilled a sense of responsibility that would continue to grow as they matured. And as night fell, bringing soft shadows and the distant twinkle of stars, the children felt a connection that transcended the physical encounter. The lessons, the messages, and the silent guidance had become a living presence, embedded in consciousness and perception, rippling outward into the way they experienced the world. They understood, even at this young age, that awareness, care, and thoughtful action were inseparable, and that the subtle, quiet teachings they had received were now a part of them, forever guiding, forever illuminating, forever expanding the reach of understanding. Chapter 11. Whispers of the Forest. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall mayambo trees surrounding the Ariel School playground, casting playful shadows that danced gently with the breeze. The air carried the subtle scents of earth, grass, and the lingering moisture of dawn. For the children, the world was quietly transformed, imbued with the memory of what they had seen, heard, and felt. Even the forest seemed different, alive in a way that demanded attention, reverence, and care. Walking toward the edge of the playground, the children were drawn to the trees, their curiosity guided by something both familiar and mysterious. The gentle rustle of leaves whispered secrets that were not words, but impressions, feelings, and images. Much like the silent communication they had received from the beings, some children paused, placing their hands lightly on the bark of a tree, feeling its texture, warmth, and subtle energy. The sensation was grounding, almost like a bridge connecting the memory of the encounter with the natural world that surrounded them. The whispers of the forest seemed to echo the messages of the beings. Observing closely, the children noticed patterns in the leaves, the way branches bent, and the dance of light filtering through gaps in the canopy. Shadows moved with rhythm, and the wind created arcs and lines that mirrored the delicate motions of the smaller lights they had seen hovering in the sky. It was not coincidence, it was a subtle language of connection, a reflection of order and intention present in the world, waiting to be understood by those who were attentive. Small groups of children ventured deeper into the edges of the woodland, exploring while maintaining awareness of the lessons they had been given. "Look at the patterns," one whispered, tracing the outline of overlapping leaves. "It's like the forest is speaking to us," said another, voice barely audible over the wind. The children recognized that listening was not about sound alone. The forest spoke through sight, sensation, rhythm, and even intuition. They were learning to interpret the subtleties, to read the natural signs as an extension of the being's silent guidance. The forest also offered opportunities for reflection. Children paused at small clearings, noticing sunlight reflecting off blades of grass or a puddle, watching the ripples as they distorted the reflections. Every movement, every shift in light, became a canvas for observation and understanding. They experimented with tracing shadows, arranging leaves, and mimicking the movements of light and branches. These quiet exercises reinforced perception, observation, and interpretation, the tools necessary to decode the deeper messages they had received earlier. Some children felt compelled to express their reflections creatively. They drew intricate patterns in dirt or sand, using leaves, twigs, and stones to replicate the shapes they observed. Others sketched in notebooks, capturing not only shapes, but also the feelings and impressions that accompanied each observation. These creative acts became a form of meditation, a method for internalizing lessons, and a gentle dialogue between memory and perception. Through this, the forest itself became a teacher, guiding the children as they practiced the attentive, reflective skills the beings had modeled. Conversations among the children became thoughtful and reflective, imbued with empathy and insight. "Do you think the forest knows we are listening?" one child asked. Another replied softly, "Maybe it always knows. Maybe it's waiting for us to notice." These exchanges revealed the emerging understanding that awareness is not passive. It requires presence, care, and attentiveness. The forest was not a backdrop. It was an active participant in their learning, responding to observation with subtle cues and patterns. Even simple motions, like walking along paths or climbing small rocks, became exercises in mindfulness. Children noticed how their movements affected leaves, how shadows shifted with their steps, and how small changes in position revealed previously unnoticed patterns of light and motion. Each action reinforced lessons of awareness, connection, and responsibility. They realized that their interaction with the environment was a form of dialogue, where observation, respect, and care shaped the quality of understanding. The whispers of the forest also prompted reflection on time and change. Children observed how the light shifted as the sun moved, how the shadows lengthened and shortened, and how patterns in nature evolved throughout the day. This observation mirrored the impermanence and interdependence of all things. The beings had shown them that noticing, reflecting, and understanding required patience and attention to subtle transitions. The forest, with its continuous movement, became a living lesson in rhythm, balance, and the passage of time. Some children began to relate their observations to broader lessons about responsibility. They noticed litter, broken branches, and signs of disturbance in the woodland and felt a quiet urge to correct it. Small acts of care, picking up discarded paper, adjusting a fallen branch, or gently moving stones, became expressions of the principles they had learned. It was as if the forest itself rewarded attention and effort, reinforcing the ripple of understanding that had begun with the morning's encounter. As the day unfolded, the children also reflected on their interactions with each other. Empathy and cooperation deepened as they shared observations, insights, and creative expressions. They listened carefully, considered others' perspectives, and worked together to decode patterns and meanings. The whispers of the forest seemed to foster not only individual understanding, but also collective wisdom. In collaboration, they discovered new insights, realized overlooked details, and reinforced each other's perception and reflection. Even quiet contemplation revealed layers of understanding. Children sat under the canopy, feeling the warmth of sunlight, hearing the faint rustle of leaves, and sensing the subtle vibrations of the earth beneath them. Thoughts of the beings and their silent messages emerged naturally, reinforcing lessons about attentiveness, responsibility, and the delicate balance of life. The forest, like the beings, communicated without words, and the children realized that the ability to perceive such messages required a calm, open, and reflective mind. The day was also filled with wonder and curiosity. Children observed patterns of insect movement, the intricate construction of spider webs, and the way sunlight created prisms in water droplets. Each observation became an opportunity to connect with the lessons of the beings and to appreciate the complexity, beauty, and intelligence of the world around them. They were learning to approach life with both humility and attentiveness, recognizing that the smallest details often carried profound meaning. By late afternoon, the whispers of the forest had become an enduring presence. Even when children walked back toward the playground or their classrooms, they retained their rhythm, patterns, and awareness cultivated among the trees. Every glance, every movement, and every reflection carried the imprint of the forest's subtle teachings, a constant reminder that observation and understanding were intertwined with care, responsibility, and empathy. The forest's whispers also instilled patience. The children learned that not every detail revealed itself immediately, and that some lessons required time, repeated observation, and quiet reflection. The process of discovery was gradual, like the gentle unfolding of shadows or the slow arc of sunlight across leaves. This patience mirrored the way the beings had communicated, subtle, deliberate, and persistent, leaving traces of insight that could be followed and deepened over time. As evening approached, the children paused one last time beneath the trees, noticing the fading light, the soft sway of branches, and the quiet chorus of the forest settling into night. They felt a connection that extended beyond themselves, beyond the school, and beyond the moment. The whispers of the forest were more than patterns of light and sound. They were a living dialogue, a reflection of the being's message. and a reminder of the interdependence, intelligence, and responsibility inherent in the world. By the end of the day, the children understood something extraordinary, that observation, reflection, and care were inseparable, that subtle messages could be found in the natural world, and that the lessons of the beings extended far beyond the morning encounter. The forest, alive and responsive, had become both teacher and companion, guiding the children in attention, empathy, and awareness. The whispers were enduring, and the children were ready to carry these lessons forward, integrating the silent wisdom into their perception, behavior, and choices for years to come. Chapter 12. Shadows and Reflections. The morning light filtered gently through the horizon, spilling golden warmth across the Ariel School grounds. The air was fresh, carrying the subtle scent of earth, grass, and distant trees. It was a day like any other, yet for the children who had witnessed the crafts and beings, nothing could ever feel ordinary again. A quiet tension hummed beneath their movements, a ripple of awareness that accompanied each glance, each step, and each breath. On the playground, shadows stretched long and thin, dancing gently with the rhythm of the breeze. The children paused to watch these elongated shapes, noticing how they intertwined with one another, how they shifted with subtle variations in light, and how even the smallest detail held a rhythm that could be read. To them, shadows were no longer mere absences of light. They were reflections of movement, emotion, and life. The lessons from the beings had trained their eyes and minds to observe, to reflect, and to understand in ways far beyond ordinary perception. Some children began to experiment with shadows, moving slowly to see how their forms interacted with the ground, walls, and each other. They traced outlines, compared lengths, and noted patterns. Each interaction was an exercise in observation, attention, and reflection. In these playful yet deliberate moments, the children internalized lessons about cause and effect, the interconnectedness of action and consequence, and the subtle intelligence of the environment around them. Reflections in puddles, glass, and polished surfaces also drew their attention. Water, in particular, became a source of fascination. A single ripple distorted an entire scene, turning ordinary objects into abstract forms that seemed alive. The children noticed that reflections were not passive. They changed, responded, and revealed hidden dimensions of perception. By observing carefully, they learned to see the familiar in new ways, discovering layers of meaning previously unnoticed. These exercises in observation extended beyond simple play. They became meditative practices, moments of quiet concentration that honed the children's awareness. Each child approached shadows and reflections differently. Some moved deliberately. Others simply watched, while a few sketched patterns on paper or in the dirt. What united them was intention. Every action was mindful, every gaze deliberate, every observation reflective. This was the subtle power of the being's message, manifesting in daily life. Even the smallest details held significance. A fluttering leaf could mirror the motion of the smaller lights. A shifting cloud could mimic the angles of the crafts. A ripple in water could evoke the gentle curves of their metallic surfaces. Each pattern, repetition, or subtle change became an opportunity to deepen understanding, to practice attention, and to engage with the world in a more thoughtful, deliberate way. The ordinary became extraordinary, and the children began to see life as a tapestry of subtle connections, patterns, and lessons waiting to be interpreted. Conversations among the children were quiet but profound. "The shadow moves like it's alive," one whispered, kneeling by a puddle to watch a distorted reflection. Another replied softly, "It's like everything around us carries a message if we just notice." The words were careful and tentative, as though speaking aloud might disrupt the delicate flow of observation. Yet by sharing thoughts, the children reinforced collective understanding, creating a network of attention, reflection, and interpretation that enriched each individual's perception. In classrooms and corridors, the lessons continued subtly. Children traced patterns on paper, drew reflections, and discussed observations with curiosity and care. The ability to notice subtle shifts in light, shape, and movement had become second nature. They understood that observation was not passive. It required patience, focus, and awareness. They learned that meaning could be hidden, waiting quietly to be discovered, and that even small acts of attention could yield profound insights. The forest edges surrounding the playground also offered lessons. Shadows of branches, leaves, and twigs intertwined with sunlight, creating dynamic patterns that shifted with every gust of wind. Children noticed these interactions, recognizing that nature itself was communicating through rhythm, movement, and form. Each pattern mirrored the silent lessons of the beings: subtlety, connection, attentiveness, and the importance of interpreting signals beyond words. As the day progressed, the children reflected on the emotional resonance of shadows and reflections. They realized that understanding was not just intellectual but also felt. Shadows could evoke awe, curiosity, and a quiet sense of mystery, while reflections encouraged introspection and connection with the world around them. They discovered that perception was multi-layered, combining observation, feeling, and interpretation to form a holistic understanding of life and the environment. Small acts of care continued to reinforce lessons. Children adjusted fallen branches, moved objects gently, and ensured that the spaces they observed remained undisturbed. They learned that respect for the environment was not option-lit, was part of the dialogue between observer and observed. The lessons of the beings had extended beyond sight and feeling into responsibility, and the children practiced this quietly, consistently, and naturally. Even moments of stillness carried significance. Sitting quietly by a tree, observing the interplay of light and shadow, a child could feel a deep connection to the morning's encounter. The ripples of understanding from that single event extended into every perception, every reflection, and every interaction. Each pause, each breath, and each attentive moment was a continuation of the silent guidance the beings had offered. The children also began to recognize the interplay between shadow and reflection and human interaction. Just as shadows mirrored physical forms, emotions and intentions were reflected subtly in gestures, expressions, and tone. They learned to read these reflections, not as judgment, but as insight, cultivating empathy and understanding in a way that extended beyond the natural world into human relationships. This was the quiet power of observation, the ability to perceive layers of meaning without explicit instruction. By late afternoon, the children's awareness had deepened further. Shadows and reflections had become a lens through which the world was interpreted, a reminder of subtlety, connection, and attentiveness. They carried the silent messages of the beings, not only in memory, but also in perception, integrating lessons into every movement, choice, and glance. They were learning that life communicated constantly, that attention and reflection were keys to understanding, and that every moment offered opportunities to engage with subtle truths. The day's observations were also shared with peers, reinforcing communal understanding. Children compared reflections, discussed shifting shadows, and explored patterns collaboratively. Through these interactions, they discovered that shared observation enriched individual perception. The ripple effect of learning grew wider, creating a network of awareness and understanding that extended beyond personal experience into a collective consciousness shaped by curiosity, attentiveness, and care. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet, the children paused for one last reflection. Shadows stretched long across the playground, reflecting patterns of movement, light, and time. Reflections shimmered in puddles, capturing glimpses of sky, trees, and themselves. Tesa simple subtle phenomena were no longer mundane. They were gateways to understanding, extensions of the beings, teachings, and reminders of the interconnectedness of life, perception, and responsibility. By the end of the day, the children had internalized a profound lesson. That meaning is often hidden in the quietest, subtlest places, that shadows and reflections carry insight, instruction, and emotion, and that attentive observation can transform ordinary experiences into extraordinary understanding. The beings' silent messages had taken root deeply within their perception, cultivating mindfulness, empathy, and awareness in ways that would endure for a lifetime. The world, as the children now knew, was alive with signals, patterns, and meaning. It whispered through shadow, shimmered in reflection, and resonated with intention. The encounter at Ariel School had revealed that even the smallest details held significance, and that perception was a doorway to understanding. In shadows and reflections, in light and silence, the children continued to carry forward the lessons imparted by beings who had taught without words, guiding their curiosity, empathy, and attention with subtlety, care, and enduring wisdom. Chapter 13. The Ripple of Realization. The day had started quietly at Ariel School, with the gentle hum of morning life surrounding the playground. Birds chirped softly, the wind whispered through the trees, and sunlight painted warm, dappled patterns across the grass. But for the children who had glimpsed something extraordinary years before, this day held a subtle tension, a feeling of anticipation that stirred curiosity and wonder deep within. It was a day to notice, to reflect, and to sense the ripple of realization that came with growing understanding. Observation became their first tool. The children had learned, over countless mornings, that the world was full of subtle cues, delicate patterns, and hidden connections, waiting to be discovered. Today, they focused on light, the way it shifted across the playground, moved through leaves, and reflected off distant surfaces. Each change in illumination carried a story, a lesson in perception and attentiveness. The ripple of realization was subtle at first, like the soft vibration of water when a pebble is dropped into a calm pond. In pairs and small groups, the children experimented with movement. They noticed how shadows shifted, how sunlight caught a blade of grass at the perfect angle, and how small changes could create cascading effects. "Did you see that?" whispered one child, pointing to a shadow stretching across the playground. Another nodded, understanding instantly. Each observation was a thread in a growing tapestry of awareness. They began to realize that every action carried consequences, no matter how small, and that careful observation could reveal patterns invisible to the casual eye. The ripple extended to sound as well. Children listened to the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of insects, and the soft movements of their peers. Every sound was part of a broader environment, woven into a delicate network of cause and effect. They noticed that when they moved slowly, the forests responded differently. When they spoke softly, the birds remained. The shadows lingered longer, and the sunlight seemed to filter more gently through the trees. It was as if the world itself was alive to their attention, responding to observation with subtle guidance. Memory played a crucial role. Children recalled the beings they had once glimpsed, the silver crafts hovering silently, and the telepathic impressions that had communicated care, concern, and warning. These memories were no longer frightening. They were informative, guiding attention and sharpening perception. Each recollection acted as a lens, allowing the children to notice details they might have overlooked, to interpret patterns more accurately, and to connect present observations with past experiences. The ripple of realization was also emotional. Children began to feel a connection not only to each other but to the environment around them. They experienced moments of awe, curiosity, and calm that carried through their movements and interactions. Laughter became softer, conversations more thoughtful, and gestures more deliberate. They recognized that awareness was not purely intellectual. It was embodied, emotional, and experiential. Understanding flowed not only through thought but through feeling, intuition, and reflection. Patterns emerged in unexpected ways. A falling leaf traced a curved path, casting a shadow that danced across the playground. A bird's wings reflected sunlight in fleeting bursts, illuminating hidden corners and drawing attention to unnoticed details. Children began to see repetition, rhythm, and flow in movement, realizing that the smallest actions could resonate through the environment like ripples across a pond. This insight deepened their awareness, teaching them patience, attentiveness, and the importance of timing. Interpersonal observation became equally important. Children noticed subtle shifts in each other's expressions, posture, and tone. A quiet nod, a small smile, or a fleeting glance communicated volumes, revealing thought, curiosity, or understanding. They learned to listen without words, to respond with care, and to recognize that awareness extended beyond the visible and audible into subtler realms of perception. Connection, they realized, was layered, intricate, and responsive, requiring empathy as much as attention. The ripple of realization carried into creative exercises. Children traced light patterns, drew shapes formed by shadows, and mirrored the movement of leaves in gentle choreography. These activities reinforced observation, patience, and interpretation, showing that creativity and awareness were deeply intertwined. By expressing patterns physically or artistically, children strengthened both understanding and memory, linking observation, reflection, and embodiment into a cohesive learning experience. Even mundane objects became teachers. Pebbles on the ground, blades of grass, or twigs cast shadows that shifted with the sun's movement. Children traced these changes, noting how angles, shapes, and distance influence perception. Each small observation became a lesson in detail, precision, and attentiveness. They realized that understanding was built incrementally through repeated observation, reflection, and integration. Every ripple of attention created waves of insight, reinforcing a growing sense of connection to the environment. By mid-morning, children noticed patterns in movement. Leaves fell, shadows stretched, and birds changed direction, often in response to subtle cues. They began to predict sequences, anticipate changes, and notice relationships between elements that had seemed disconnected. Observation became predictive, analytical, and reflective, deepening their ability to perceive connections across space, time, and scale. The ripple of realization now extended beyond individual moments, revealing overarching patterns and relationships. Conversation amplified insight. Children shared observations. Did you see how that leaf spun before it touched the ground? Yes. And notice how its shadow changed as it fell. These exchanges were not merely descriptive, they were reflective, analytical, and integrative. Dialogue reinforced memory, clarified perception, and expanded understanding. Children discovered that awareness could grow exponentially when shared, with each insight sparking further observation and reflection. The horizon became a symbol of these realizations. Rolling hills, distant trees, and shifting clouds offered new patterns to observe, new interactions to trace, and new insights to integrate. Children learned to see not only the immediate details, but also the broader context in which those details existed. Awareness expanded outward, encompassing multiple scales, sequences, and perspectives. Each layer added depth, clarity, and richness to perception. Emotional intelligence intertwined with observational skill. Children noticed how patterns affected feelings. The calm sway of leaves, the soft glow of sunlight, or the rhythmic movement of shadows induced focus, curiosity, and mindfulness. They understood that observation and emotion were inseparable, each informing and reinforcing the other. Awareness was holistic, integrating senses, mind, and heart into a single attentive presence. By afternoon, children experimented with intentional interaction. They moved deliberately, observing how gestures influenced shadows, light, and reflection. Collaboration deepened insight, as paired movements created combined patterns, demonstrating interdependence and emergent properties. Children discovered that awareness was participatory. Perception influenced the environment, just as the environment shaped perception. The ripple of realization became a living lesson, interactive, dynamic, and endlessly engaging. Memory again provided continuity. Past experiences, the silver crafts, and telepathic impressions acted as reference points, helping children interpret new patterns and anticipate outcomes. They recognized that learning and awareness were cumulative, with each observation building upon previous experiences, each reflection adding depth, and each memory shaping perception. The ripple of realization connected past, present, and potential future understanding into a coherent continuum. By late afternoon, children understood that the ripple of realization extended beyond themselves, their peers, and the immediate environment. It connected to the broader world, the trees, the sky, the wind, and even the lessons carried from earlier encounters. Awareness was a network, a subtle and intricate web linking observation, action, reflection, and emotion. Each thread reinforced another, creating a resilient and interconnected structure of understanding. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the playground, children reflected on the journey of observation, connection, and insight. The day had revealed that every action, gesture, and observation carried consequences, subtle yet meaningful. Awareness was both personal and collective, flowing outward in waves, rippling across environments, and interweaving perception with memory, insight, and emotion. By the end of the day, children carried a profound understanding, Realization is not instantaneous, it spreads like ripples across a pond, touching every element, every observer, and every moment. Observation, reflection, and mindful engagement are keys to perceiving connections, understanding patterns, and integrating lessons. Awareness, once cultivated, becomes a guiding force, informing action, emotion, and thought. The ripple of realization extended beyond the playground, beyond Ariel School, beyond time itself. Children left the day with perception sharpened, insight deepened, and curiosity fully ignited. The lessons of observation, connection, and reflection would continue to resonate, shaping understanding, empathy, and awareness for years to come. By the end of the day, the children understood that every moment carried the potential for learning, every detail a thread in a larger pattern, and every observation an opportunity for growth. The ripple of realization had transformed their awareness, guiding them gently, persistently, and thoughtfully toward deeper understanding of themselves, each other, and the world around them. Chapter 14. The Language of Light. The day dawned softly over the Ariel School grounds, the early sun painting long strokes of gold and amber across the playground. Even in the ordinary rhythm of morning, a quiet anticipation filled the air. For the children who had witnessed the crafts and beings, light was no longer simply illumination, it was a language, a guide, and a reflection of meaning waiting to be understood. The beams of sunlight filtered through the mayambo trees, creating dancing mosaics of shadow and brightness across the grass. Children paused to notice the angles of the light, the way it shifted as the sun rose, and how it interacted with leaves, puddles, and objects on the ground. Each observation was a lesson in attentiveness, revealing subtle patterns that mirrored the movements of the smaller crafts they had seen hovering silently in the sky. The light was speaking, not with words, but with rhythm, intensity, and motion, inviting the children to listen with their eyes, minds, and hearts. Some of the children experimented with reflections, directing light through glass bottles or puddles, watching how it split, refracted, and danced across surfaces. They observed the colors, patterns, and movements, noting the ways the light interacted with materials, surfaces, and space. Through these quiet explorations, they discovered that light had nuances, moods, and messages, subtle hints that carried meaning for those patient enough to notice. Movement and attention became intertwined. When a leaf trembled in the breeze, the sun's rays transformed it into a kaleidoscope of shifting shapes and colors. The children realized that their perception could capture the fleeting beauty of the world, just as the beings had conveyed impressions that were felt rather than spoken. Each moment of observation deepened their understanding of subtlety, pattern, and interconnectedness. The language of light extended beyond play and observation. It became a tool for reflection, contemplation, and expression. Some children traced sunbeams across paper, creating intricate sketches of lines, angles, and reflections. Others arranged objects in patterns to explore how shadows interacted with brightness. Each creative act was a dialogue between perception and expression, a way of internalizing lessons and translating them into tangible forms. In this process, the children discovered that light could convey emotion, intention, and insight in a way that words often could not. Quiet conversations emerged naturally as the children shared observations. The way the light bends over the puddle, it est like it is trying to show us something, one whispered. Another added softly, it's almost like the crafts, or the beings, left clues in how everything moves and shines. These reflections demonstrated the integration of past experiences with current perception. The children were beginning to see the world as a network of signals and patterns, where meaning was encoded in the natural phenomena surrounding them. Even routine movement carries significance. Walking along paths, arranging stones, or adjusting the position of objects became exercises in attention and care. The children noticed how light shifted with each action, and how small changes could dramatically alter the patterns they observed. Each interaction reinforced lessons of responsibility, observation, and attentiveness. The environment responded to their focus, reflecting subtle truths back to them in ways that deepened understanding. In classrooms, lessons were enriched by observation of light. Sunlight streaming through windows created shifting patterns on walls, floors, and desks, which children studied with patience and curiosity. They observed how brightness intensified or softened, how shadows moved, and how the interaction of light and object created unexpected beauty. Through this exploration, the children understood that attention could unlock understanding, and that light itself could be a teacher, revealing patterns and rhythms that conveyed knowledge without words. The natural world outside continued to offer lessons. Branches swayed gently, casting complex, interwoven shadows across the ground. Each movement of the leaves reflected subtle rhythms, arcs, and motions that mirrored the dynamics of the crafts above the playground. Children traced these movements with their eyes and fingertips, noting patterns, repetitions, and deviations. They discovered that, even in ordinary observation, meaning could be found if they looked carefully, attended deeply, and reflected quietly. Light also guided introspection. The children began to notice their own reflections in puddles, mirrors, and shiny surfaces, recognizing how their presence affected patterns, shadows, and brightness. They learned to see themselves not as separate from the environment, but as active participants in a complex, interconnected system. Each action, each choice, and each observation contributed to the balance of their world, and the subtle lessons of the beings were reinforced through these interactions. Conversations turned toward responsibility and ethics. If light shows us patterns, can it also show us what we should do? One child asked. Another replied, maybe it's about noticing, and then choosing carefully. The dialogue reflected an emerging understanding. Perception alone was not enough. Awareness carried responsibility. Observing, understanding, and reflecting were intertwined with action, care, and intention. The silent guidance of the beings had planted seeds, and now the children were beginning to nurture them into understanding and choice. Even quiet play became a lesson in attention. Games were now approached with mindfulness, observing movement, light, and interaction. Children noticed how shadows shifted with motion, how the sun altered the perception of color, and how subtle gestures could influence outcomes. These exercises reinforced patience, observation, and reflection, demonstrating that every action had effect, and that attention to subtle details could deepen understanding in ways both practical and profound. By mid-afternoon, the children's relationship with light had matured. They saw it as a dynamic, expressive force that carried meaning, instruction, and reflection. Patterns, reflections, and shadows were no longer incidental, they were deliberate, subtle guides for thought, feeling, and action. The morning's lessons had deepened their perception, cultivated empathy, and strengthened attention, preparing them to see connections not just in light, but in life itself. As the day progressed, children experimented further, exploring prisms, reflections, and interplay between natural and artificial light. Each experiment reinforced lessons of subtlety, observation, and interpretation. They realized that the world communicated constantly, offering hints, impressions, and insights to those who listened with care. Light became a living language, a teacher that spoke without words, a guide for awareness, perception, and thoughtful action. By late afternoon, the children gathered once more beneath the trees, observing sunbeams streaming through branches, playing over puddles, and glinting on leaves. The interplay of light and shadow created dynamic, shifting mosaics that seemed alive, reflecting patterns of movement, emotion, and intention. Each child felt the quiet resonance of understanding, a deepening connection to the natural world, to one another, and to the subtle lessons imparted by the beings. The day concluded with an awareness that had grown steadily, like a gentle tide, expanding outward with curiosity, attentiveness, and care. Light had become a teacher, a mirror, and a messenger, revealing subtle patterns, rhythms, and truths waiting to be discovered. The children had learned to observe with patience, interpret with reflection, and act with intention. They had discovered a silent, radiant language that guided perception, inspired thought, and nurtured empathy. As evening approached and the sky softened to shades of rosella lavender and deepening blue, the children carried the lessons with them. The patterns of light, the subtle movements of shadows, and the quiet reflections would remain etched in their perception, guiding attention, awareness, and thoughtful action in the days to come. They had learned that the world spoke in myriad ways, and that the ability to perceive, reflect, and respond was a gift that had been quietly nurtured by beings who had visited for only a moment, yet had left a lasting imprint on consciousness, curiosity, and care. By the end of the day, the children understood that the language of light was everywhere. In reflections, shadows, and the subtle interplay of illumination, there was meaning, instruction, and wisdom. And with that understanding came the realization that they were now part of a living, interconnected dialogue, one that would continue to guide them, teach them, and inspire them, quietly, patiently, and profoundly, for the rest of their lives. Chapter 15. The Silent Teachers. The day began with a soft, diffused light that bathed the Ariel School playground in gentle warmth. The air carried the familiar scents of earth, grass, and distant woodland. For the children, mornings were no longer simply about routine. Each day held a subtle invitation to observe, reflect, and learn from the world around them. The encounter had shifted their perception, teaching them to notice that every detail, every motion, every pattern carried a message if one was willing to listen. Walking across the playground, the children became attuned to the smallest movements of leaves, shadows, and sunbeams. They noticed how branches swayed in tandem with the wind, how sunlight shifted across the grass, and how tiny insects traced paths that reflected the geometry of leaves above. These observations were not mere distractions. They were lessons, subtle and silent, offered by the world itself. The children began to see the entire environment as a classroom, one that required patience, mindfulness, and attentive care. The term silent teachers became their unspoken understanding. Shadows, reflections, patterns of movement, and even the rhythm of their own footsteps carried guidance. They realized that not all learning required words. Sometimes, observation and reflection were enough. Sitting beneath a tree, one child watched the sun filter through branches, noticing how the shifting light mirrored the shapes of the smaller crafts seen in the sky. The world was speaking in forms, in motion, in subtle signals. The beings had taught them this language, and now the children were translating it on their own. Some children experimented with patterns, arranging leaves, stones, and twigs to replicate shapes observed in nature. Others recorded impressions in notebooks, capturing not just forms, but feelings, moments of wonder, curiosity, and subtle understanding. These exercises nurtured both perception and creativity. The children discovered that the world could teach them lessons about attention, responsibility, and interconnectedness, that they approached it with patience and care. Quiet reflection became a natural part of their day. Some children paused mid-step, noticing the interplay of light and shadow on the playground or the subtle vibration of the earth beneath their feet. Others observed how birds adjusted their flight paths with the wind, or how clouds shifted in intricate patterns across the sky. Every observation reinforced the understanding that the world was alive with signals, messages, and patterns waiting to be noticed. The playground became a microcosm for broader lessons about perception. Children compared the way sunlight reflected off a puddle with the way shadows stretched across the grass. They noticed repetitions, deviations, and subtle variations, understanding that these nuances held meaning. "Do you see how the shadow bends, like the craft?" one child whispered. Another replied, "It's like it's showing us movement we might not otherwise notice." These reflections were quiet, thoughtful, and imbued with curiosity. Shared understanding that learning could happen in silence, through attention and observation. Even the smallest gestures were meaningful. Children learned that simple acts, such as adjusting a fallen branch or carefully placing a stone, could influence patterns of light and shadow. Each interaction reinforced the lesson that their presence had consequences, and that mindfulness, care, and reflection were inseparable. The environment responded subtly to their actions, mirroring the guidance of the beings and nurturing a sense of responsibility that was quietly transformative. The silent teachers extended beyond the playground. In the nearby woodland, children noticed patterns in the branches, the rhythm of the wind, and the way sunlight dappled the forest floor. Each observation offered insight into natural cycles, rhythm, and balance. They learned to see interconnectedness in the simplest of phenomena: fallen leaf, a shifting shadow, a ripple in water. The lesson was clear. Attention to detail and presence in the moment could reveal truths hidden in plain sight. The children also reflected on human interaction. They began noticing subtle gestures, expressions, and tones, recognizing that these carried meaning beyond words. Just as shadows and reflections revealed hidden patterns in nature, the behavior of peers and adults mirrored intention, feeling, and thought. Observation became a tool not just for understanding the environment, but also for empathy, communication, and connection. Silent teachers were everywhere, sometimes in trees, sometimes in shadows, sometimes in the glance of a friend. During quiet play, children experimented with movement, light, and sound. They observed how actions influenced shadows, how reflections altered perception, and how patterns repeated and evolved. Each experiment reinforced attentiveness, reflection, and understanding. They discovered that learning was not passive, it was interactive, dynamic, and immersive. The silent teachers were patient, offering guidance in subtle ways that required effort, observation, and reflection to decode. Conversations remained soft and reflective. "The tree moves like it's breathing," one child noted. Another added, "And the way the sunlight shifts, it feels like it's teaching us patience." These observations reinforced the understanding that learning was experiential, continuous, and intertwined with observation, feeling, and interpretation. The children were developing a keen sense of awareness, connecting intuition with empirical observation, and curiosity with reflection. Even stillness became a lesson. Sitting quietly on a bench or under a tree, children noticed the patterns of wind, the subtle shifts of light, and the soft movements of animals. They realized that silence was not empty. It was space for attention, reflection, and understanding to grow. The being's silent communication had extended into the world around them, and now the children were learning to listen without expectation, observe without judgment, and understand without words. By mid-afternoon, the children had internalized the principle that observation itself could be transformative. Every glance, every reflection, every moment of attentiveness nurtured awareness, empathy, and understanding. The silent teachers, the trees, shadows, reflections, and natural patterns were everywhere, waiting for engagement, recognition, and reflection. Through patient observation, the children learned the subtle rhythms of life, the patterns of the environment, and the unspoken wisdom embedded in nature. The lessons of the silent teachers were reinforced through collaboration. Children shared observations, discussed patterns, and explored relationships between light, shadow, and movement. They discovered that collective attention deepened individual perception, creating a network of awareness that amplified understanding. In sharing, the children not only learned more, but also strengthened bonds of empathy, cooperation, and shared curiosity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange, pink, and violet, the children paused to reflect on the day. The interplay of light and shadow, the subtle patterns in the playground, and the quiet whispers of nature had all become part of a broader lesson. Observation, reflection, and responsibility were inseparable, and the world was alive with signals waiting to be noticed and understood. By the end of the day, the children understood that learning could happen silently, subtly, and persistently. The silent teachers had offered guidance, not through words, but through patterns, rhythm, and attention. They had taught patience, care, empathy, and awareness skills that would endure far beyond the playground and the woodland, shaping perception, behavior, and understanding for years to come. The world had become a living classroom where every shadow, reflection, and movement carried insight, wisdom, and gentle guidance. The children, guided by memory and curiosity, were learning to read this language of subtlety, integrating the silent messages into their perception, interactions, and choices. And in this quiet, attentive observation, they discovered a profound truth, that the world itself was alive with learning, teaching, and understanding, waiting for those willing to notice, reflect, and care. Chapter 16, Whispers in the Wind. The morning air carried a softness that seemed to hum with hidden messages. At Ariel School, the familiar sounds of birdsong, the rustle of leaves, and distant footsteps blended seamlessly with a quiet, unspoken sense of anticipation. For the children, mornings had taken on a new quality. Each breeze, each rustle, each movement in the surrounding woodlands seemed alive with subtle meaning, whispers that could only be understood through careful attention and reflection. Walking along the school grounds, the children felt the wind brush against their skin, tousling hair brushing against their arms, and moving through the trees in rhythmic undulations. It was not just air, it was a messenger, carrying impressions, patterns, and insights that seemed to echo the silent communication of the beings they had once encountered. They had learned that the world spoke in many languages, and today, the wind had its own story to tell. Some children paused mid-step, closing their eyes to better sense the flow of air around them. They noticed how the wind shifted subtly when they moved, how it responded to obstacles, and how its patterns intertwined with shadows, leaves, and the sunlight filtering through branches. These observations were deliberate, patient, and quiet, forming a dialogue between the children and the environment. In listening closely, they discovered that the wind carried not just physical sensations, but also a rhythm, a pattern, and a narrative waiting to be interpreted. The whispers in the wind were more than movement, they were layered with meaning. A flicker of a leaf against the sunlight could evoke the motion of the crafts. A gentle gust across the playground mirrored the subtle gestures of the beings. Each signal was delicate, almost imperceptible, yet profound. The children had learned that the world communicated not just through overt events, but through subtleties that required patience, attention, and presence to perceive. They began experimenting with these patterns. A child would raise an arm, letting the wind catch it, and observe how it changed direction, how the leaves danced around it, and how shadows shifted across the ground. Another child traced swirling currents along puddles and reflective surfaces, noting how movement and pattern interacted. Every experiment was a lesson, reinforcing observation, reflection, and the subtle connection between action and environment. As the day progressed, conversations arose naturally, soft and reflective. "The wind seems to carry stories," one child whispered. Another responded, "It moves like it's remembering something, like it wants us to notice." Their words were tentative, but full of curiosity and wonder. Through these dialogues, they began to integrate memory, observation, and intuition, realizing that the world's language was not just external, it resonated within, shaping awareness and understanding. The environment itself became an active participant. Leaves twirled with purpose, shadows stretched and contracted, and sunlight shifted across patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Children noticed these subtleties, connecting them with past experiences and observations, building a continuous narrative of learning that merged the seen and the felt, the natural and the intuitive. Each observation deepened awareness, patience, and empathy. Quiet moments of stillness became exercises in perception. Sitting beneath a tree, a child noticed how the wind bent branches, how the sunlight shimmered through leaves, and how a bird's motion traced delicate arcs across the sky. They began understanding that every small movement, every shift in pattern, carried significance. Nature was not static, it was alive, instructive, and communicative, offering lessons that could be deciphered through attention, reflection, and careful observation. Children also discovered that the wind had a way of reflecting their own intentions. When they moved with intention, the wind seemed to mirror their gestures. When they paused in mindfulness, it danced gently around them, as if responding to their awareness. This subtle interplay fostered a sense of connection, a realization that they were part of a dynamic, living system where observation and presence could shape experience. The school grounds became a laboratory for these lessons. The children moved along paths, observing interactions between wind, light, and shadow, tracing patterns in grass and leaves, and interpreting subtle changes in the environment. Each step became a practice in attention, empathy, and reflection. They discovered that meaning was woven into the fabric of life, present in every breath, every ripple, every gentle shift in motion. Collaborative observation deepened understanding. Children compared how wind patterns shifted across different areas, how shadows lengthened or shortened in response to sunlight, and how reflections in puddles or windows captured the rhythm of movement. Sharing these observations enhanced collective awareness, creating a subtle network of insight that strengthened their ability to perceive, interpret, and respond thoughtfully. Even the smallest natural events held significance. A drifting feather, a swirling leaf, or a fleeting shadow became a source of wonder and reflection. The children noted that these details, often overlooked, carried layers of meaning. They realized that paying attention to subtlety could reveal insight, understanding, and a deeper connection to the environment. The world was alive, responsive, and full of lessons for those patient enough to notice. The whispers in the wind also evoked emotional reflection. Children noticed how a soft gust could calm their minds, how sudden shifts could spark curiosity or surprise, and how the rhythm of air carried mood and energy. They began to associate emotional resonance with observation, recognizing that perception was not just intellectual but also felt, connecting thought, feeling, and understanding in a holistic experience. By mid-afternoon, the children had internalized a profound sense of environmental awareness. The wind, shadows, and light had become teachers, guiding attention, shaping perception, and encouraging mindfulness. The lessons of the beings were reinforced through these subtle interactions, reminding the children that the world's messages were continuous, layered, and waiting for discovery. Each observation, each breath, and each attentive moment contributed to their growing understanding of interconnectedness, empathy, and responsibility. Even routine moments, walking to class, arranging materials, or observing the playground, carried opportunities for learning. The children practiced patience, observed carefully, and reflected quietly. The wind and its whispers had become a bridge between memory, perception, and understanding, extending the lessons of the encounter into daily life. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the playground, the children paused to reflect on the day as they understood that the environment was alive with subtle guidance. The wind, shadows, reflections, and patterns were all messengers, inviting awareness, interpretation, and thoughtful engagement. Through these whispers, the children continued to carry the teachings of the beings, integrating them into perception, understanding, and experience. By the end of the day, a quiet, collective realization had emerged. The world communicated constantly, often in ways too subtle for casual attention. Those who paused, observed, and reflected could perceive patterns, messages, and lessons that were otherwise invisible. The children had become adept at listening to the whispers in the wind, noticing the interplay of shadow, light, and movement, and translating these subtleties into understanding, empathy, and action. The whispers were gentle, persistent, and profound. They carried reminders that the world was alive, attentive, and interconnected, that every action, every observation, and every moment of awareness contributed to a larger pattern of life. The children had learned that learning did not always require words. It existed in the rhythm of air, the dance of leaves, and the quiet spaces between moments. By engaging with the world in this way, the children were becoming guardians of perception. They observed deeply, reflected mindfully, and responded with care. They understood that their awareness, attentiveness, and presence were gifts, tools for understanding the environment and navigating the subtle, interconnected world around them. As evening settled softly over Ariel School, painting the sky in dusky shades of lavender, rose, and gold, the children carried the whispers in their minds, the silent lessons in their hearts, and the subtle understanding of the world into the night. The wind had spoken, the shadows had danced, and the reflections had shimmered, each conveying a quiet, persistent message. And the children had listened, learned, and absorbed the wisdom, ready to carry it forward in the days to come. By the end of the day, they knew that the world was alive with whispers, and that attentive, reflective observation was the key to understanding, connection, and mindful living. Chapter 17. Patterns in the Sky. The morning sky above Ariel School stretched wide and endless, painted in soft hues of pale, blue, and gold, inviting observation and quiet wonder. For the children who had witnessed the crafts and beings years ago, the sky was no longer just a backdrop to play and study. It had become a canvas of meaning, a subtle storyteller, and a teacher in its own right. Every cloud, every shifting light, and every movement across the horizon carried the potential for insight and understanding. As the children gathered outdoors, they noticed the gentle rhythm of birds in flight, the sweeping arcs traced by insects, and the patterns formed by clouds drifting lazily in the sky. These observations were not casual. They were deliberate, attentive, and reflective, a continuation of the lessons instilled by the beings they had once encountered. Each child was learning to observe carefully, trace subtle patterns, and see the extraordinary in the ordinary. Some children lifted their gaze higher, following the flight paths of birds, noting how their formations shifted with the wind. Others traced the outlines of clouds, imagining shapes, movements, and connections that spoke to them silently. The sky, in its ever-changing canvas, was alive with patterns waiting to be recognized, decoded, and understood. In this gentle attention, the children found a quiet, thrilled sense that the universe itself was offering lessons and reflections. Light played a crucial role in these observations. Sunlight filtered through clouds, reflecting off leaves, buildings, and puddles, creating patterns that mirrored movement and energy in subtle ways. The children began to see correlations between light, movement, and meaning. A shimmering reflection across a puddle could resemble the way smaller crafts had glinted in the sky. A streak of sunlight through a cloud could echo the graceful arc of a being's movement. Every subtle nuance became a thread in the growing tapestry of understanding. The children also experimented with shadow and perspective. Shadows cast by trees, buildings, and playground equipment offered unexpected patterns that shifted with time, angle, and movement. By observing these, children discovered that patterns were dynamic, dependent on perspective, and influenced by multiple factors. This was a lesson both in perception and in the interconnectedness of the environment, teaching that understanding required patience, attentiveness, and reflection. Quiet conversation emerged as children shared their observations. "See how the cloud stretches, like it's pointing toward the horizon," one whispered. Another added, "It's almost like the sky is drawing maps for us to follow." These reflections were tentative but full of wonder. Blending curiosity with imagination and observation, each child was learning that interpretation was not just about seeing, but about noticing, reflecting, and connecting the dots in ways that enriched understanding. Patterns in the sky also taught lessons about patience and timing. The children noticed how formations changed slowly over time, how light shifted subtly, and how clouds moved in rhythm with wind currents. Observation required stillness, mindfulness, and an appreciation for gradual change. Each passing moment offered new insights, and the children began to see that the universe often communicated not through urgency, but through quiet persistence and repetition. The sky became a mirror for understanding movement, connection, and intention. Children compared the arcs of birds with the patterns traced by sunlight across reflective surfaces, noting similarities, differences, and relationships. They began to see that natural patterns often mirrored universal dynamics, movements, rhythms, and sequences. They transcended individual phenomena. Observation became a bridge between the seen and the understood, teaching that attentiveness could reveal profound truths hidden in plain sight. Even ordinary play integrated these lessons. Games of catch, movement across the playground, and imaginative storytelling all incorporated awareness of the sky. Children noticed how their actions influenced shadows, how trajectories traced by thrown objects mirrored arcs in nature, and how light enhanced perception. Through play, they internalized principles of observation, reflection, and interpretation, blending learning with joy, curiosity, and creativity. The patterns extended beyond the sky itself. Reflections in windows, puddles, and shiny surfaces provided parallel exercises in observation. Children discovered that the principles governing patterns in the sky applied elsewhere. Symmetry, repetition, variation, and response. By tracing movement and light in multiple contexts, they reinforced understanding, connecting aerial patterns to terrestrial observations, and integrating lessons across domains of perception. The children also began noticing subtle messages in color and tone. Shifts from blue to gold, or the layering of cloud hues, carried emotional resonance and implied meaning. Observing these shifts nurtured emotional awareness, empathy, and sensitivity. They learned that perception was holistic, combining visual, emotional, and intuitive dimensions to build understanding. The sky became both a scientific and emotional teacher, guiding observation, reflection, and insight. Collaboration amplified perception. Children shared findings, compared patterns, and discussed subtle changes over time. Collective attention strengthened individual observation, allowing the group to perceive nuances that might have gone unnoticed alone. They discovered that learning and understanding could be enhanced through shared awareness, dialogue, and reflection, reinforcing empathy, cooperation, and collective insight. Even mundane moments revealed hidden lessons. A drifting leaf, a fluttering bird, or a shifting shadow could echo larger patterns in the sky. Children learned to remain attentive, noticing repetitions, anomalies, and variations, understanding that meaning was often encoded in subtle, interrelated details. Observation became a skill, a practice, and a lens through which the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary. By afternoon, the children had developed a deepened sensitivity to patterns. They understood that the sky was not static, it was alive, interactive, and informative. Clouds, birds, sunlight, and shadows were all part of a language waiting to be understood. Observation, attention, and reflection became second nature, and each child carried a growing sense of connection to the rhythms, cycles, and messages of the world above. The sky also became a space for reflection on memory and experience. Children noticed echoes of the craft's movement in patterns traced by clouds and light, connecting past encounters with present observations. This reflection reinforced understanding, curiosity, and attentiveness. The sky was both a record and a teacher, offering lessons about movement, timing, perspective, and meaning. Evening arrived with soft colors fading into twilight. The children paused to appreciate the sky's subtle transformations, noticing the interplay of light, shadow, and atmosphere. Each shift reminded them that patterns were continuous, evolving, and interconnected. They carried forward the understanding that observation was not a momentary act, but a continuous, attentive practice on ongoing dialogue with the world. By the end of the day, a quiet sense of wonder and understanding settled over the children. The sky had become a partner in perception, offering insight, reflection, and guidance. Every arc of cloud, streak of light, and pattern of movement contributed to lessons of attentiveness, curiosity, and interconnectedness. The children had learned that by observing carefully, reflecting deeply, and noticing subtle signals, they could decode the messages of the universe. In this shared experience, they discovered a profound truth. Patterns exist everywhere, waiting to be recognized, interpreted, and honored. The sky, once a mere backdrop, had transformed into a teacher, a guide, and a mirror of understanding. Observation was not passive, it was active, engaged, and full of discovery. And the children, quietly attentive, had become students not just of the sky, but of life itself. By the end of the day, they knew that understanding was cultivated in stillness, curiosity, and careful attention. The patterns in the sky had shown them that every moment, every shift, and every observation carried wisdom for those willing to see, listen, and reflect. Chapter 18. Messages in motion. The day unfolded with a quiet rhythm, the kind that seemed almost orchestrated by unseen hands. At Ariel School, the children had grown accustomed to noticing what most overlooked: the subtle patterns in movement, the gentle sway of leaves, the way shadows shifted across the playground, and the delicate dance of sunlight filtering through the trees. Today, those observations took on a new layer, as the children began to recognize movement itself as a form of communication, a silent, flowing language that carried meaning, intention, and insight. It began with small gestures, a bird swooping low across the grass, a dragonfly hovering in precise arcs above the pond, or a ripple in the water when a stone fell. Each movement seemed deliberate, rhythmic, and full of nuance. The children, attentive as ever, observed these motions with care, noticing timing, direction, and subtle variations. They realized that movement was not random. It held patterns, intention, and a story waiting to be decoded. Some children experimented with movement themselves, imitating the arcs of leaves drifting in the wind or the loops traced by birds in the sky. They discovered that by mirroring motion, they could deepen their understanding of rhythm and form. Each experiment became a lesson in perception, reflection, and engagement. Movement, they learned, was not just physical, it was expressive, communicative, and revealing. The subtle communication extended to their peers. Children noticed how gestures, expressions, and body language conveyed emotions, intentions, and responses without a single word spoken. A tilt of the head, a shift in posture, or the gentle sway of an arm could reveal curiosity, attentiveness, or empathy. They began understanding that all movement carried information and that the world, like their peers, was full of signals waiting to be read and interpreted. Even routine activities became opportunities to observe messages in motion. The way a branch swayed in response to wind, how sunlight shifted across the playground, or the ripple of water in a puddle. These were patterns to analyze and understand. Children practiced patience and attentiveness, learning to perceive subtle connections, anticipate shifts, and interpret signals in ways that were both analytical and intuitive. Quiet reflection played a key role. Sitting beneath the trees, the children observed how shadows elongated, how the wind bent branches, and how leaves rotated midair. Each subtle motion carried insight, teaching that attention to detail could reveal patterns invisible to casual observation. Through patience, they began decoding the gentle lessons woven into every movement, connecting physical phenomena with memory, intuition, and understanding. The lessons of movement extended beyond nature. During games, children noticed timing and coordination, observing how their own actions influenced and responded to others. They began understanding principles of cause and effect, rhythm and coordination in social and environmental contexts. Movement became a form of dialogue, a silent, flowing conversation between observer and observed, self and environment, action and reaction. Collaborative experiments deepened comprehension. Children worked together to trace patterns of motion, compare observations, and predict outcomes. They noticed consistencies and variations, understanding that patterns could repeat, evolve, and inform understanding. Shared attention amplified individual perception, creating a collective awareness that revealed subtleties invisible to a single observer. Through collaboration, they cultivated both insight and empathy. Even fleeting movements carried lessons. A butterfly fluttering along a garden path, a ripple across a puddle, or a cloud drifting in the sky became opportunities to trace flow, sequence, and rhythm. Children learned that careful observation of small, transient events could reveal principles that applied to larger systems. The language of motion was everywhere, from the smallest leaf to the broadest sky, waiting for patient attention to translate it into understanding. The environment itself seemed to respond to their presence. A gentle breeze shifted leaves when they paused nearby. Sunlight refracted differently as they adjusted their positions. Shadows danced in playful arcs. Children noted these subtle interactions and understood that presence, attention, and movement influenced perception, creating a dynamic dialogue between themselves and the environment. They realized that communication was not one way of reactive attention or motion invited a response. Throughout the day, patterns in motion became intertwined with emotional reflection. The rhythm of movement evoked feelings of calm, curiosity, or wonder. Children noticed that observing or participating in motion could shape their moods, enhance focus, and encourage deeper understanding. They began integrating emotional awareness with observation, recognizing that perception was not solely visual or intellectual, it was experiential, felt, and connected to inner states. As the afternoon progressed, children experimented with rhythm and repetition. They traced arcs in the air, skipped along patterns in the sand, and imitated the flow of branches in the wind. Each movement reinforced awareness, patience, and attentiveness, creating a rich feedback loop between action, observation, and reflection. They discovered that repetition could clarify patterns, reveal connections, and enhance understanding of both natural and social dynamics. The lessons were reinforced through reflection and dialogue. "Did you see how the branch moved when I stepped back?" one child asked softly. Another responded, "Yes, it mirrored your motion almost perfectly, like it was listening. These exchanges highlighted the interactive nature of movement, emphasizing attentiveness, interpretation, and respectful observation. Children began recognizing that understanding motion required both awareness and dialogue, a merging of self, environment, and peers. Even subtle disturbances offered insight. A leaf trembling in the wind, a ripple caused by a falling insect, or a shadow shifting imperceptibly all were valuable data points for careful observation. Children learned to remain attentive to micro-events, understanding that significance often resides in subtlety. Through patient observation, they decoded layers of meaning, revealing complex interactions that shaped both environment and perception. The sky itself remained an active participant. Clouds drifted, sunlight shifted, and birds traced arcs above, reflecting principles of motion, rhythm, and timing. Children connected terrestrial patterns with aerial phenomena, building a holistic understanding of flow, interaction, and continuity. Observing both sky and ground, they traced relationships, identified rhythms, and recognized that movement was a universal language linking multiple layers of reality. By late afternoon, the children's awareness had deepened. They understood that movement carried information, reflected intention, and connected observer with environment. Every gesture, ripple, or ripple of air offered insight, teaching that communication extended far beyond words or symbols. The silent language of motion was omnipresent, awaiting those willing to see, interpret, and reflect. The day's reflections also nurtured a sense of personal responsibility. Children realized that their actions, however small, influenced patterns, rhythms, and perceptions. By moving with intention, patience, and awareness, they contributed to the harmony and clarity of the environment. Lessons of empathy, observation, and ethical engagement were embedded in each gesture, creating a continuity between perception, action, and understanding. As the sun began to set, painting the horizon in shades of rose, amber, and violet, the children paused to appreciate the subtle lessons of the day. Movement was everywhere, low, fast, imperceptible, grand, and each motion carried meaning, insight, and connection. The world communicated in motion, and the children, attuned and attentive, had learned to read, reflect, and integrate these messages into their perception and understanding. By the end of the day, a quiet, shared understanding had emerged. Patterns in motion, subtle and persistent, held wisdom for those who observed attentively. The children had learned to perceive flow, recognize rhythm, and translate movement into insight. Through careful observation, patient reflection, and attentive engagement, they had internalized the lessons of communication without words. Language as old as life itself, spoken in every breeze, ripple, and gesture. And in these messages in motion, the children discovered a profound truth. The world communicates constantly, patiently, and elegantly, waiting for those who are willing to watch, reflect, and learn. Chapter 19. Echoes of Understanding. The morning sun rose gently over Ariel School, casting soft golden light across the playground and the surrounding woodland. The world seemed to awaken slowly, each leaf, blade of grass, and tree branch catching the light in a delicate interplay of shadow and brilliance. For the children, the day was not just another series of lessons or playtime. It was a continuation of an exploration, a journey into understanding the subtle, silent language of the world around them. As they gathered outside, a quiet anticipation hung in the air. The memories of the past of silver crafts, beings with large black eyes, and the telepathic messages they had once received were no longer just recollections. They had become guides, shaping perception, enhancing awareness, and attuning the children to the layers of meaning woven into every moment, movement, and pattern around them. Today, they sought echo stresses of understanding, signals of insight, and reflections of past lessons manifesting in the present. The first echo revealed itself in the wind. Gentle gusts swirled around the children, brushing against arms, ruffling hair and carrying the faint scent of earth and leaves. Each child paused, closing their eyes to better sense the subtleties, noticing how the wind shifted in response to their presence, how it seemed to follow patterns, and how its rhythm mirrored natural cycles. They understood, intuitively, that the wind carried knowledge not in words, but in patterns, vibrations, and impressions waiting to be interpreted. Shadows played their own part. The sunlight moved across the playground. Long streaks stretched and shrank, shifting with time and motion. Children observed how the shadows responded to the environment and their own actions, revealing connections between presence, movement, and perception. A simple gesture, like raising a hand or walking along a path, could transform the patterns around them, producing new echoes, new insights, and new threads of understanding. Conversations among the children grew soft, reflective, and intentional. "Do you see how the shadow changes when I move?" one whispered. Another nodded. "It's almost like it's following us, reminding us of what we did before." These exchanges were not casual. They were part of a collective observation, a shared decoding of subtle signals, a reflection on how presence, intention, and perception intertwined. Each child contributed to the group's awareness, reinforcing lessons in empathy, attentiveness, and reflection. Patterns in the natural world became more apparent as the morning progressed. The swaying of trees, the rippling of water in puddles, and the movements of insects and birds all carried a rhythm, a sequence, and a pattern waiting to be noticed. Children traced these patterns with their eyes and movements, connecting them to past experiences, memories of the crafts, and lessons from the beings. They began recognizing the interconnectedness of all things, the idea that motion, presence, and energy were linked in ways both visible and invisible. Even simple objects became teachers. A stone rolling down a gentle slope, a feather drifting to the ground, or the fall of a leaf from a branch were observed carefully, with attention to speed, direction, and interaction with the environment. The children learned that every motion, no matter how small, was a microcosm of a larger principle: cause and effect, rhythm and balance, anticipation and reflection. Each observation became a lesson in understanding, patience, and mindful engagement. The sky itself was alive with echoes. Clouds shifted and stretched, tracing arcs and curves that mirrored motions closer to the ground. Birds flew in coordinated patterns, their flight reflecting rhythm, timing, and alignment. The children connected these aerial patterns with terrestrial movements, observing repetition, variation, and balance. They understood that patterns were not isolated, they were universal, present across scales and waiting to be interpreted through careful attention and reflection. During quiet moments, children reflected on their own movements. How did their walk-in, gestures, and actions influence the shadows, leaves, and light around them? How did their attention shape the environment? They realized that understanding was not just about observation, it was about engagement, interaction, and awareness. By being mindful of their presence, they could sense echoes of their actions in the world, tracing connections between intention, perception, and outcome. Collaborative observation continued to enhance learning. Children worked together to notice patterns, share findings, and predict outcomes. They compared shadows, leaf movements, and light patterns, integrating insights into a collective understanding of the world. Through these interactions, they learned not only about the environment, but also about cooperation, empathy, and shared attention. Knowledge, they discovered, grew stronger when observed collectively and reflected upon thoughtfully. Even fleeting events carried meaning: a sudden gust of wind, a bird's abrupt flight, or the ripple of water caused by a falling insect, were opportunities to trace cause, effect, and connection. Children learned that significance often resided in the briefest, most delicate moments, and that careful attention could reveal patterns and lessons hidden in plain sight. Patience, focus, and mindfulness became tools to decode these subtle signals, transforming ordinary events into extraordinary learning experiences. The echoes of past encounters infused every observation. The silver crafts and beings with large black eyes were no longer distant memories, they were reference points, markers of curiosity, and symbols of learning. Children recalled the impressions of telepathic messages, warnings about technology, environmental destruction, and responsibility. Each echo in the natural world reminded them of these messages, reinforcing lessons of care, mindfulness, and connection. By afternoon, children began to see the integration of all lessons. Wind, light, shadow, movement, and memory formed a web of understanding, a network of insights that stretched across time and space. Each observation reinforced the last. Each reflection deepened perception, and each interaction built a layered understanding of the world's silent language. The children realized that learning was cumulative, layered, and enriched through repeated attention and reflection. Emotion intertwined with perception. Observing echoes of understanding brought quiet joy, satisfaction, and curiosity. Children felt the subtle resonance of alignment between observation and insight, recognizing the emotional dimensions of learning. Awareness became a full-bodied experience, integrating visual, emotional, and intuitive perception into a cohesive sense of understanding. As the sun dipped low, casting golden and lavender hues across the school grounds, the children paused to reflect. The day had been filled with subtle messages, gentle movements, and quiet lessons. They had traced echoes in the wind, shadows, reflections, and patterns, building a tapestry of understanding that connected memory, perception, and insight. Every motion, gesture, and observation carried meaning, each echo reinforcing lessons learned from the past and integrated into present awareness. By the end of the day, a profound realization had emerged. Understanding was not a static state, it was dynamic, interactive, and reflective. The world constantly offered echoes of insight, lessons in attentiveness, and opportunities for connection. The children had learned to perceive these echoes, trace patterns, and integrate understanding into both observation and action. The echoes of understanding, subtle and persistent, would guide them beyond the playground, beyond Ariel School, and into the wider world. They had learned to see, feel, and interpret the language of the environmental language, expressed not in words, but in motion, reflection, and resonance. These lessons were enduring, forming a foundation for lifelong curiosity, awareness, and engagement with the world around them. And as evening settled softly, painting the sky with fading gold, rose, and violet, the children carried the echoes in their minds, hearts, and awareness. They understood that observation, reflection, and attentive engagement were pathways to wisdom, empathy, and understanding. The lessons of the day, the messages in motion, the patterns in light, the whispers in the windwood remain with them, guiding perception, shaping curiosity, and nurturing a deep, enduring connection with the world. By the end of the day, they knew that understanding was alive in every moment, echoing silently through the environment, waiting for patient, attentive, and reflective minds to perceive and integrate its wisdom. Chapter 20. Threads of Connection. Morning unfolded gently over Ariel's school. Soft rays of sunlight, illuminating the familiar playground and surrounding trees. For the children, the day was no ordinary one. It was a continuation of a journey that had begun years ago with a glimpse of silver crafts and beings whose presence had altered their perception forever. Today, they would explore connections threads that wove the world together, linking sky to earth, self to waters, and past experiences to present understanding. These threads were not visible at first glance. They existed in subtle rhythms, delicate patterns, and interactions that required careful observation. The children began by noticing how the branches of trees intertwined, how shadows fell over one another, and how the wind moved leaves in sequences that seemed almost choreographed. Every motion, every pattern, and every light reflection revealed hints of connection threads, invisible yet tangible to those who watched with attention. The first lesson of connection appeared in the way sunlight moved across the playground. Golden light reflected off surfaces, bounced into corners, and shifted with the movement of clouds. The children observed how the same patch of light could touch different surfaces at different times, creating patterns and sequences that echoed throughout the day. They began to see that even small shifts could influence broader patterns, and that awareness of these shifts could uncover relationships between seemingly separate elements. Birds became messengers of connection. The children watched their flight patterns, noticing how the movements of one bird influenced the formation of others. A shift in direction, a sudden turn, or a change in altitude created ripples that echoed across the flock. Children understood that every action had an effect, and every movement was part of a larger pattern. They realized that connection was not only spatial but temporal, unfolding across time as actions, responses, and reactions intertwined. Water, too, revealed hidden threads. A puddle formed after early morning rain reflected the sky, clouds, and surrounding trees. The children traced ripples caused by falling leaves or stepping stones, observing how movement created concentric patterns that radiated outward, influencing the reflections and surfaces nearby. In this, they saw a metaphor for connection itself, how small actions could reverberate, subtly altering relationships and outcomes, and teaching lessons in causality, interdependence, and attentiveness. The children began exploring interpersonal connections with newfound awareness. Simple gestures, words, or shared glances became threads, linking one child to another. They noticed how laughter, curiosity, or a gentle hand on a shoulder could create responses, echoing kindness, empathy, and attentiveness. Observing these interactions revealed that understanding others required awareness, reflection, and responsiveness, skills that mirrored lessons learned from the natural world. Collaboration became a key component of exploration. Children paired up to observe patterns in nature, replicate sequences of movement, or trace connections between sunlight, shadow, and motion. Sharing observations and insights amplified awareness, revealing layers of subtlety and complexity that individual observation alone might have missed. They learned that connection was both personal and collective, deepened by attention, communication, and shared understanding. Even the smallest details carried significance. A blade of grass bending under a breeze, the slow rotation of a flower toward sunlight, or the tremor of leaves in response to nearby movement all were threads waiting to be recognized. The children understood that awareness was essential to perceive these threads, and that recognition required patience, focus, and careful attention. Connection, they realized, existed at every scale, from the tiniest leaf to the expansive sky above. Patterns and movement reinforced understanding of threads. The children watched insects trace loops through the air, ripples spread across water, and shadows stretch and contract. Each motion offered insight into relationships between elements, how forces influenced one another, how rhythm and timing created sequences, and how even subtle changes could cascade through the environment. Through repeated observation, they learned that connection was dynamic, intricate, and always present. Memory played a vital role. Children recalled the being's messages, the silver crafts, and the telepathic impressions received so many years ago. They traced echoes of these experiences in the patterns they observed today, connecting past lessons to present perception. These memories acted as threads themselves, linking experience, understanding, and interpretation in a continuous chain that guided attention and inquiry. Emotional awareness intertwined with observation. Children noticed how patterns of light, shadow, or movement influenced feeling, curiosity, wonder, or attentiveness. They discovered that connection was both external and internal, linking perception to emotion, action to response, and reflection to insight. Observation became a holistic experience, blending intellectual, emotional, and intuitive dimensions to create a deep understanding of interrelated threads. By mid-morning, the children began experimenting with creating threads themselves. They moved through the playground deliberately, observing how gestures, steps, and actions influenced shadows, leaves, or reflections. They coordinated movements with peers to produce patterns in space, rhythm, and light. Each experiment revealed principles of alignment, interdependence, and influence, reinforcing understanding of connection in both natural and social contexts. The threads extended to imagination and creativity. Children traced patterns in clouds, envisioned arcs connecting the movement of birds to ripples in water, and imagined interactions between sunlight, shadows, and wind. These mental exercises strengthened observation, reflection, and interpretation, showing that connection was not only physical, but conceptual, a way of understanding relationships, sequences, and the flow of energy across systems. Conversation enriched perception. Children shared observations, compared sequences, and speculated on causes and effects. "Did you notice how that leaf fell right after the shadow passed?" One whispered. Another added, "It's like everything is connected, even in ways we can't always see." These exchanges nurtured critical thinking, attentiveness, and empathy, reinforcing the notion that connection was both observable and experiential, present in the world and in shared awareness. By afternoon, the children's awareness of threads had deepened profoundly. They recognized connections between sky and ground, light and shadow, movement and stillness, presence and response. Observation had become a practice, reflection had become a habit, and understanding had become layered, nuanced, and interconnected. They had learned that every moment, every gesture, and every observation was a thread linking them to the environment, to Oyet's order, and to deeper insight. Evening arrived slowly, draping the school grounds in soft gold, amber, and rose hues. The children paused to reflect on the day's lessons, noticing how shadows lengthened, how leaves swayed gently, and how the sky's colors shifted in harmony. Each change was a thread, an echo of movement, and a silent message waiting to be perceived. They understood that connection was continuous, flowing through all things, and accessible to those willing to watch, reflect, and engage mindfully. By the end of the day, a quiet, shared understanding settled over the children. Threads of connection, subtle yet persistent, wove a tapestry of meaning that linked perception, action, memory, and insight. Observation was not passive, it was active, attentive, and reflective. Through mindfulness, collaboration, and reflection, the children had cultivated the ability to perceive relationships, anticipate consequences, and integrate understanding into both thought and action. The threads extended beyond the playground, beyond Ariel School, beyond the moment. They connected past experiences, current awareness, and future insight. They linked sky to earth, self to others, observation to understanding, and presence to responsibility. The children carried these threads forward, recognizing that connection was a living, breathing element of perception, learning, and life itself. And as night fell softly, stars beginning to twinkle in the sky above, the children felt the invisible threads stretching from them to the universe. They understood that every action, every observation, and every reflection was part of a vast, interconnected web. The lessons of the day, woven into the threads of connection, would guide their perception, deepen their understanding, and nurture curiosity, empathy, and insight for years to come. By the end of the day, they knew that understanding was never isolated. It existed in movement, reflection, memory, and awareness. Threads connected all things, waiting for attentive, patient, and mindful observers to perceive, interpret, and integrate their wisdom. And the children, now attuned and aware, had become skilled at recognizing, following, and learning from these silent, subtle threads of connection. Chapter 21, The Horizon of Awareness. The sun rose slowly over Ariel School, spilling a gentle golden light across the playground and the surrounding woodland. It was a day like no other, not because of the ordinary lessons or familiar routines, but because the children now carried within them a profound awareness that stretched beyond what they had ever known. They had been through a journey of observation, reflection, and subtle understanding. And today, the horizon itself seemed to invite them to look further, beyond the trees, beyond the playground, and beyond the limits of ordinary perception. Morning began with stillness. The children sat beneath the trees, letting their senses expand outward. They listened to the wind rustling leaves, felt the warmth of sunlight on their skin, and watched the shadows lengthen and shrink in rhythmic patterns. Every sensation was magnified, not through force, but through attentiveness. They had learned that awareness was not something to be hurried or grew patiently, quietly, and steadily, like the branches of a tree reaching for light. A soft movement in the sky caught their attention. A bird traced a delicate arc, wings glinting in the morning light. The children followed the motion, noting its speed, trajectory, and rhythm. It was more than just a bird. They understood it as a signal, an echo of larger patterns, a thread connecting movement, timing, and intention. In this simple observation, they grasped the invisible laws that guided both natural and subtle phenomena. The horizon invited reflection, rolling hills in the distance, interspersed with patches of woodland, reflected sunlight in varied shades of green and gold. Clouds drifted slowly, tracing patterns across the sky. Children observed how light, shadow, and motion intertwined, understanding that the world was a tapestry woven of layers, rhythms, and interactions. Every glance toward the horizon became an exercise in patience, perception, and insight. Conversation flowed quietly among them. "Do you see how the clouds move differently over the hills?" One whispered. Another replied, "Yes, it's like the landscape guides them, shaping the patterns they follow." In these exchanges, children recognized that observation was enhanced through sharing perspectives. Awareness was not only individual, it was amplified, clarified, and enriched through connection and dialogue. The principles they had learned, the careful reading of movement, the tracing of threads, the recognition of echoes, now merged into a broader understanding of the horizon. It was a symbol, a reminder, and a teacher. Children realized that horizons were not just distant landscapes, but metaphors for possibilities, growth, and expanded perception. The horizon challenged them to see beyond immediate surroundings, to notice subtle connections, and to integrate lessons into broader awareness. The sky itself became a canvas of lessons. Sunlight shifted in intensity and angle. Clouds changed shape and density, and the wind carried gentle whispers through leaves and branches. Every change was a subtle signal, a moment to interpret, a thread of understanding to follow. Children had learned to read these signals with patience, to observe without rushing, and to reflect without judgment. Each observation was a step toward deeper insight and harmonious perception. Even small movements carried significance. A leaf spiraling downward, a ripple across a puddle, or the flutter of a butterfly's wings became opportunities to trace patterns, anticipate consequences, and explore rhythm. Children noted the sequences, compared them to prior experiences, and integrated their observations into an evolving understanding. The horizon was alive with these interactions. A small event, a microcosm of the larger patterns that guided life. The horizon also invited introspection. Children considered how their own actions influenced the environment, their peers, and even their own perceptions. They traced the threads of influence, noticing how gentle movements, thoughtful gestures, and mindful attention could ripple outward, creating subtle effects. Understanding, Tay rarely said, was not merely about seeing, it was about engaging consciously, acting responsibly, and observing the consequences of those actions. Patterns repeated across space and time. They observed the sun casting repeated shadows, the clouds moving in cycles, and the wind flowing through trees in rhythmic sequences. The children connected these repeating patterns with earlier lessons, integrating them into a holistic understanding of rhythm, flow, and interconnectedness. Repetition was not monotonous. It was a teacher, offering clarity, consistency, and insight. As the morning moved toward noon, children experimented with conscious interaction. They adjusted movements to see how shadows shifted, how leaves responded to subtle gestures, and how reflections altered with slight changes in position. They began to recognize that observation and participation were inseparable, that the horizon responded not only to the environment, but to attentive, mindful presence. Action and perception merged into a continuous dialogue, revealing subtle lessons about balance, awareness, and responsibility. The horizon also held an emotional resonance. Watching the sun rise higher, clouds drift, and shadows move evoked feelings of calm, wonder, and curiosity. Children noticed that perception was not merely cognitive, it was deeply emotional, intertwined with mood, attention, and reflection. Awareness was a full-bodied experience, encompassing senses, mind, and heart. Every glance toward the horizon reinforced the emotional dimension of learning, nurturing empathy, patience, and mindful engagement. Collaborative observation continued to strengthen understanding. Children worked in pairs and small groups, tracing light patterns, shadow movement, and wind flow. They compared sequences, discussed findings, and reflected on cause and effect. These interactions demonstrated that connection, awareness, and insight were amplified through shared attention. Observation was never solitary, it thrived in dialogue, collaboration, and attentive engagement, memory intertwined with present observation. Children recalled the silver crafts, the beings with large, the whisper lingers. And so, our journey comes to a gentle pause, though the story itself does not truly end. The morning at Ariel School in 1994 may have been a fleeting moment in time, yet its echoes stretch far beyond that small playground in Rua. 62 children saw something extraordinary, and their memories have carried forward, whispering across decades, inviting all who listen to pause, to notice, and to reflect. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this tale is not what they saw, but what they felt, the silent communication that carried urgency, care, and an invitation to awaken to the world around us. It was a reminder that awareness is a gift, and that perception, when combined with reflection, can grow into understanding, empathy, and responsibility. The craft, the beings, the shimmering light stay were catalysts. The real story is what lives inside each observer, in every quiet thought, every gentle choice, and every mindful action. As you close your eyes tonight, consider what whispers may surround you in your own life. What subtle patterns, connections, or insights might you be overlooking? How might your attention, your care, and your curiosity ripple outward into the world, shaping it in ways unseen? The Ariel School experience reminds us that extraordinary truths often emerge in ordinary moments, and that the most profound revelations may arrive silently, softly, and with unwavering clarity. Let the whisper linger. Let it guide your thoughts, inspire your choices, and invite you to see the hidden threads that weave through life, time, and consciousness. And in that quiet reflection, you may find your own awakening, the gentle realization that observation, awareness, and care are not only gifts, but responsibilities. The sky over Rua still stretches vast and infinite, and though the beings may no longer be visible, their message endures. It waits for anyone willing to look beyond the ordinary, to listen beyond the noise, and to carry forward the quiet, persistent whisper of understanding, ethics, and wonder. Sleep now and dream with open eyes. The universe has always been speaking, you only need to listen.